We are calling to order public meeting number 237 of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, Thursday, March 1st at our offices in Boston about 10 o'clock in the morning. And we have Commissioner McDonald calling in from afar. Commissioner McDonald, can you hear us all right?
I can.
Okay, and we can hear you fine too. So because we have one member remote, we will have our votes by roll call. Are you prepared to, we're not doing minutes this week. Since we had a meeting last week, we don't have the minutes prepared yet. We'll catch up at our next meeting in 2 weeks. Excuse me, and we will go first to item number 2, the administrative update, Executive Director Bedrosian.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
My general update will be, I guess, inclusive of item B, which is really MGM opening update. And I want to describe to you what our preparations would be. But I will tell you that at the next meeting, which we anticipate will be in 2 weeks, Mike Mathis and I anticipate coming before the commission and giving you a dual update on what's happening. So as we prepare our preparations, I look at our preparation in terms of 4 distinct buckets. The first bucket is MGM's requirement to satisfy all the conditions necessary for a gaming operations certificate. And in that preparations, what is happening is they continue to submit their internal controls. We continue, as you know, and I don't know if we have it, well, we don't have any today, but you've seen a lot of regulations that we're updating. They have made security and surveillance submissions, their table and slot game submissions. We are working on a time frame in which they would submit their gaming beverage license. As you know, and I think, I don't know if Commissioner Stebbins went, but we had the gaming school was opened last week on February 26th. We had some of our gaming agents there. MGM had some of their trainers there. So we are also on top of that. Our gaming technology is getting ready. The floors, we understand the gaming floor at MGM is almost done, and they could take delivery slot machines as early as April. So we're preparing for that. And obviously a big one that the commission tackled last week was licensing, SER exemptions. That will go a long way towards letting us prepare for what that tsunami will be or won't be, and the collateral implications on the research side of still trying to capture the people who no longer register with us, but capture them for research purposes. So we have a lot going on there. So that's on.
You might explain that again, just to make sure people understand what you're referring
and I might not do it as well as I suggest you'll fill in where I miss. But, you know, one of the research items we're doing is trying to find out who is employed in the industry and who came from either being unemployed or underemployed.
Right.
And the only way we can do that, obviously, is to have that direct connection, get that information from the person.
Right.
That's easier to do when they're going through either a licensing or registration process with us. Since the good news is these people will be exempt from that for the reasons that we've talked about for a long time. The more challenging news is we lose that direct connection to the person, but we will figure out a way. We are working with MGM, and they're being very helpful for us to fill that gap.
Great.
So
good.
So that's the first bucket, what I call the operations certificate. The second bucket is, even if we give them an operations certificate, we as a gaming commission have to be ready to regulate them. So that's our internal stuff. And that I then break down to 2 different subcategories. One is the public-facing aspect of that, which is we have to hire gaming agents, and we have to have our gaming enforcement unit, which consists of the state police and the Springfield police together, ready to regulate and do what we need to do at the facility. That's the public-facing side. Mr. Ban, our HR folks have been great. They've actually had a number of public events which people who are interested in being gaming agents came and learned about what it was. We've gone through a lot of interviews. We're starting to hire our gaming agents in anticipation of getting them on board sometime in May for training. We'll get a mix of people who have never been in the industry and a mix of people who have been in the industry, but they'll still need to go through a training program. And we are still working. I think we're very close to hopefully getting our MOU done on the gaming enforcement unit. And in addition, those troopers who would join us and Springfield police officers would go through the same type of training, just on what gaming's all about, what games are all about, so they understand that lingo also.
Do you know the Game Sense time advisor time?
Yeah, so
Okay,
there's my third, that on the
Okay.
public facing aspect, there's the game sense aspect too. We're working with the Mass Council on that, in terms of what their numbers are, how they're reimbursed. That's not directly, they're not our FTEs, but they're certainly people we need to have ready. And we're working with Marlene in I think I heard, and I don't want to speak, but their anticipation is hiring up in June or July. So,
Okay.
So that's sort of the public-facing aspect of us getting ready at the MGC. The what I call our version of back of house is here at the Boston office. We need a little more support for what's happening. Derek is working on his revenue folks and making sure he has the appropriate revenue folks. A new person would be a revenue person for table games. We haven't had the deal, obviously, with table games yet, because they're just not in our foray yet. So we are doing that. Our HR requirements are growing, so we're helping Troop to get the next HR staff. And I've also started a conversation with Commissioner Zuniga, which I'll continue with the rest of the commissioners individually, on some of the other risks we're seeing at the commission, and maybe some IT staff we might want to add. But I will individually talk to you. I anticipate coming back in front of the commission with a recommendation on that sometime this month. So, and then the sort of non-exciting things but necessary things is getting an office open out in Springfield at the facility. We have plenty of space, but we need to get copiers and technology and all the things that require an office to be run. So Janice is working diligently on that with our gaming agents, who are Angela Smith, who's going to be our lead gaming agent, who's actually out there doing work on a daily basis. So we're doing that. So that's the second category. The third category is a big one, which I think you'll hear a lot more about this month, is assuring that all the license, host, and surrounding community and Section 61 commitments are being dealt with appropriately. We're very fortunate. Ombudsman Ziemba and Construction Manager Delaney have spent a lot of time working on this. I think I anticipate them coming before the commission and making sure and part of that is diversity hiring commitments, coming before the commission with a presentation on that later this month. The final bucket, so that's the third bucket. The final bucket is we also continue to work with the city of Springfield. We have a couple of corollary interests. They have commitments under their host community agreement that we also enforce through our license. So we want to make sure we're on the same page about whether the commitments have been met or not. And then secondly, just general public safety. How are we going to ensure, we are sort of responsible for the game enforcement unit for the site itself, but obviously this property is going to affect the greater Springfield area in that area. So how do we assure public safety and start getting the right people in the room? Springfield has ensured us they have absolutely been thinking about that and working on that, but it's now time to blend our efforts to make sure we're all on the same page. So those are the four big buckets. Staff is working very hard at making sure we're ready to go, and we'll come, Mike Mathis and I will come later in the, potentially the 15th, with a joint presentation.
Thank you.
Quick question, Ed. You touched on it. I had the opportunity to sit in with Director Griffin's meeting the other day out in Springfield with the Regional Employment Board and the Workforce Development Team, and obviously we brought news of the Commission's recent action on the SER change, which brought a smile to a lot of the local stakeholders and local organizations represented around the table. Kind of a quick next step, because as we looked at their hiring schedule, mass hiring in the June, I believe it was June timeframe.
Correct.
So as much as we can do to work with MGM and Elaine and Jill and begin to put the message out there about folks that, again, weren't eligible, now eligible for a number of those service jobs, being able to hear that and begin to step up to the plate.
The good news is our licensing director is sitting right to the right of me, so.
Yeah.
So yes, we had talked about that with MGM, which was the educational approach.
Right.
Of what, and we also want to be fair to those folks who still have to go through the process. So
Absolutely.
they understand what that process still is.
Yep.
So-
And MGM was quick to point out, you still have a process with us that
Right.
individuals will have to go through.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Anything else for, as part of?
Thank you. Great, thank you. So the next item, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Stempeck and Mr. Conley. This is an item I think the commission knows we've been working on anticipation of a Supreme Court ruling that could come as early as March, but we don't know. But what we wanted to do was develop guidance for the legislature in front of that decision. So I think they've done it, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Stempeck and Mr. Conley.
Good morning, commissioners. Good
Morning.
So per your instruction on the this is our white paper on sports betting that we're presenting to you today. This was a outgrowth of a variety of different things, stretching back all the way to our white paper and discussion on daily fantasy sports nearly 2.5 years ago now. Paul and I worked hand in hand on this, doing our own independent research, as well as reaching out to a number of individuals who we regard as experts in the field. That includes Chris Grove, who's a managing director at Eilers & Krejcik Gaming. That includes Will Green, a senior director of research with the AGA. Paul and I spoke with representatives from the Major League Baseball and the National Basketball Association. I attended a conference back in November in Manhattan on sports betting and sort of what will happen next in advance of the Supreme Court decision on the Christie matter. I know Paul attended a class out at UNLV last spring on sports betting, not to mention our own sort of independent research and just keeping abreast of everything that's going on. This paper really builds upon some of the themes in the DFS paper, as well as a lot of what was discussed in the joint commission the legislature put together last year on online gaming and daily fantasy sports. But this really, whereas those only really touched on the issue of sports betting, this really sort of dives into it and gets into sort of more detail about it, but also while remaining generally agnostic as to what is the best approach, but really giving a menu of a variety of approaches.
Yeah, as Justin says, and as Executive Director Bedrosian mentioned, this was really an opportunity to provide some input and guidance, not recommendations. Where these aren't our, what we try to do is not to answer all the questions, but to point out the questions that need to be answered should the legislature decide to pursue a potential, if it's even an option, of legalizing sports betting. And so we wanted to keep it very high level. Without specific recommendations, but again, just as a guide to help someone think through those questions that need to be addressed, and frankly, to keep it accessible. There's a lot of information on all these, and frankly, this is the beginning of a discussion, so we just wanted to start the conversation as opposed to try to be definitive on it.
And just to give you sort of a overview, we'll just sort of talk about the main points we make in here and sort of what we address. I mean, this paper, we start off by discussing sort of historical perspective as it comes to sports betting. We look at what does the data show us as about market size? What does it show as a potential national market size, a potential statewide market size? What does that market size mean for Massachusetts if you were to do an analysis as to potential gross gaming revenue versus what the handle is? There's a lot of confusion with these numbers, and we try and explain it in a way that a layperson, not just someone from the gaming industry, would actually understand and be able to digest, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, I'd say, where people get confused and you hear these numbers of hundreds of billions of dollars and it sounds fantastic, but let's try and drill down and find out what's the reality. What could this actually mean for the state if we were looking at line items in a budget? I also, as the legal component of this paper, I looked at the Christie decision. I looked at what the Supreme Court is looking at. I didn't get too much into the weeds in that, recognizing again that we have probably a largely layperson audience that aren't legal experts. There's a lot of things I'm interested as a lawyer in the sort of legal intricacies of the Christie decision. However, I tried to keep that relatively high level so we could just say, what's the main question here? What is the Supreme Court wrestling with? What are the possible outcomes? What would those possible outcomes mean for Massachusetts? How would Massachusetts have to react? What are the possibilities? There's nearly probably limitless possibilities. I looked at the three main possibilities that could happen after the Christie decision. And as Mr. Bedrosian noted, we're trying to stay ahead of the Supreme Court. We don't know when they're going to come out with a decision. And so a little bit of this is prognostication. We're guessing at what's going to happen, but we're also providing what does Massachusetts need to be ready for, and what are the questions that will need to be answered if and when the Supreme Court goes this way or goes that way. I also looked at what are other states doing. Almost every day you hear in the news, you hear a new state is looking at sports betting. They're either proposing legislation, they passed legislation perhaps they're just talking about it. Some states are considering it already as a future item in their budget, counting on those revenues. So I thought that's a good thing to look at. What are other states doing? And maybe that'll inform what Massachusetts what we'll do. Maybe it won't, but it at least gives us an idea, particularly those states that surround us in New England. What are those states doing? How are they moving on this issue? And how can we be smart when and if we want to move on this issue? I'll turn it.
Sure, and then we tried to transition into a framework for an approach or a potential approach for the legislature should they consider this. And we anticipated some of the clear policy objectives that they might have to include transitioning illegal activity into a legal market, capturing those potential revenues, identifying and mitigating any negative externalities such as problem gaming, and also, and importantly, expanding potentially economic opportunities to existing licensees or new entrants into the market. And so with that, there's a lot of consideration with really the primary goal being transitioning, illegal activity into the legal marketplace, and what are some of the issues you need to think through when considering that. And those include what kind of bets in what kind of modalities that the providers would be able to offer. So obviously, probably the expectation is the more and the better and the more attractive the product, the more likely you will be to dislodge people from the illegal market. And with that, comes the opportunities to capture those revenues, to provide those tools to bettors in terms of responsible gaming, et cetera. And as from a real big picture perspective, we try to touch on the basics, the who's, the what's, the when's, the how's, in terms of the legislature would need to consider who would get these licenses. Would it be existing licensees? Would it be an open marketplace? Those are questions that would need to be answered. The where, in terms of where betting would be offered. Would it be strictly in a brick and mortar environment, or would it be in a more open online and potentially mobile environment? Huge implications on what the landscape would look like depending on that decision. What types of bets? Like we had identified in the DFS paper, the emerging trends on some of these gaming categories, they evolve so quickly. And there are not only new types of sports that could be wagered on, like virtual sports, entirely virtual contests, but also in-game betting, where a contest already started and people can place bets on the very next play. Technology allows for it now. Also, how quickly would such a schema roll out? There's clearly a first mover advantage, not only for the operators, but also for the states, because if this does become a possibility, then there's every expectation that our neighboring states will jump on board and would want to be aware of that. And then finally, the hows of it. So how would it be taxed? How would it be regulated? Would there be a very strong statute like 23K that contains a lot of what would need to be done, or would you have a more nimble statute that empowers some regulatory body to actually anticipate and make those decisions up front? So again, and I hope that anyone who reads this sees that we tried not to make recommendations, but rather to, not to answer the questions, but rather to point out the questions that need to be answered. Finished.
Thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. First of all, very well done, easy to read. You hit all the highlights. Of course, I would love the who, what, when, where, and how. I just think it's a great way to lay out the considerations. So that was really well done. Also, I was really interested in the piece on minimizing the black market. I think that's critical. Whatever the legislature decides to do, if they do in fact think this is something that should be legal here in the Commonwealth, that to me would be a critical piece. And you lay out ways in which we could do that. In reading through the last couple of years, there have been some significant illegal gambling cases here in the Commonwealth. The Attorney General's gaming unit, as well as the Massachusetts State Police. And one of the common themes in reading through those cases, which were of interest to me, were not only that the customers didn't have protections, but they were actually taken advantage of in most of those cases, between odds being changed and just a number of areas in which those customers were not, it wasn't what was advertised. So that piece is really important to me, and I'm glad you took some time to talk about it in the paper and ways to minimize that.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I want to also mention that it reads really well, and I've read it now a few times. The first time, of course, with great interest, just almost like a great book that you can't wait to the next paragraph, because it really flows well the way that you formatted it. I think you touch on all of the great points that have to be made. I'm only thinking of a couple of tactical things, perhaps going forward, and I think perhaps in deference to how we make it available to the legislature, this is really we could just put a cover page, a letter from the chair, for example, to perhaps get a little bit more give context that you've made here verbally as to the why now. Why is this now relevant, as a refresher to people that don't look at these things often, and offer people up there at the legislature the ability to come meet with them to either explain these the high points in person, or have, in addition to this, just a white paper, just a one pager, let's say. It's such well summarized, and it doesn't take a position that an executive summary doesn't fall well here, because you really get right down to the nitty-gritty as to the questions, the who, the why, etc. But maybe if there was a one-pager or a short slide deck, or even just the opportunity to you, Mr. Chairman, or Ed or Justin and Paul, to meet before the committees that we report to, emerging technologies, etc. Or other interested parties, I'd say it would be really deservedly well taken. I think it really stands for itself. I think people are not going to have trouble finding the good references and all, and appreciating all the research that's behind this, which is really a testament to the work that you've done, because it's very hard to throw in a lot of the data and complicated issues just out there, and it's another thing to really summarize them for the lay person, as you say. I found also, just to touch on some of the points that I found worthy of mentioning.
Could I just interrupt there? I think that's a really important point. And I too had thought about, should there be an executive summary? But as I said to Paul and Justin earlier, I think it's so well written, and that even busy legislators will find the time. And in the conveyance to the legislators, I'm going to actually say, I know you get millions of these kinds of reports all the time, but this one is really worth reading. The cover email or letter, I still can make some of your points, but it's a quick, easy, thoughtful read. And I'm going to go out of my way to suggest that the committee chairs and so forth actually read it themselves. And I do think, if you volunteer to meet with staff, they'll probably love that. I'm sure they will.
Absolutely.
You already have. And so I hear your point. But I think it just, as you said, I think it doesn't need an executive summary. It really stands by itself, and we just need to tell folks it's worth taking the 20 minutes that it would take to
Right.
read it
Right.
in its entirety.
Right, and to that end, I can only suspect that people find different interests and go check some of the references that are here. I, for example, quickly went to how is this market size, where does this data come from? Well, it's from reputable sources and there's built-in assumptions and they're very solid. But by necessity, because this is high level, they're not all here.
Right.
There's links, there's explanations that it's very different to talk about handle than to talk about GGR or gross gaming revenue. And those are some of the things that eventually people who are going to be potentially looking at policy decisions in this matter ought to really understand. But at this point, the main takeaway is that there's a great summary here. There's great references as well. And the message that we should emphasize is, and we're more than willing and able, obviously, but hopeful that they will take us up on explaining further either the amount of research that has gone into this, and it's not all ours. You touched on all the people that you talked to, and many of them are really recognized experts in these fields. But the level of summary that by necessity has gone in here, and there's a lot more that we can also make available.
Right. I think I could speak for Paul when I say that we'd be more than happy to get into any level of detail where that this is a higher level piece of work, and we know the nitty gritty details, Paul and I, and would love to talk about them with anybody that wants more detail. This is something that I know I've been reading about and educating myself about for years now, just following the sports betting case, following the data that supports everything that goes into this paper. So that an opportunity to really educate someone beyond this. I mean, this is the door's open, I would say, to anybody who wants to come talk and get any more detail on any one of these topics. Paul and I would be more than happy to sit down and have a longer chat and more detailed conversation.
I think we have good relationships with the committee that oversees our work anyway. So I mean, it's a good starting place. I also thought this was extremely well written. The overlaying a lot of the issues that you raised with, the addition of the Wire Act, which is, again, another level to this whole policy conversation.
We were told we wouldn't talk about the Wire Act.
I know. I
kidding.
did have a question, and it's probably more of a clarification, and you touched on it a little bit. The suit that was brought against Governor Christie was by the NCAA and the 4 major sports leagues. Depending on how the Supreme Court comes down, would this open it up beyond the folks named in the suit too? We just got done with the Olympics, or Olympics folded into that. Are other amateur sports? I can't see a lot of excitement around betting on curling, but kind of draw this out
Well, you
to
never know.
different levels.
You'd be
Catching
surprised.
guys
Yeah.
doping in curling, I guess.
So I mean, PASPA is the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. So those were the right of action to sue under PASPA is granted to the NCAA and the 4 major sports leagues, as well as to any amateur sports league. So people who brought suit had a right of action to bring suit. If PASPA is kicked out entirely by a Supreme Court decision, it does open the market to betting on amateur sports, to potentially to betting on the Olympics. It's all about, then it would really likely go down, since we don't have a federal framework. If PASPA is eliminated, then it would go to a state-by-state determination of which sports they would like to be legalized and which would say, no, we're going to draw the line there. I mean, it would be something similar to what's done in Nevada, where you have, they drew a line at one point and eliminated betting on collegiate sports, and then they took that away and said, yes, you can bet on collegiate sports. So it would go to a state-by-state determination if PASPA was fully revoked by the Supreme Court.
I also wanted to make a point about that. Something that I found very helpful, which has been mentioned, is this chart of what other states have done or are doing. It's a bit of a different approaches, and that's very illustrative in and of itself. And notably, I think it's well called out that very close to us, Connecticut and Rhode Island, have already taken important steps towards what may be, depending on this decision.
Right.
And that's yet another one of the many important points when we make when we present this paper to people in the legislature, to really emphasize.
Right, and it's not just our proximate neighbors, but the Northeast in general. A lot of the projections and research indicate that the Northeast is probably the most likely, and if you think from Mid-Atlantic all the way through New England, to be one of the most densely populated areas to offer. Just state after state, it looks like there's really no one that, at least as a lot of the experts project, that would be shy to allowing sports betting and probably even aggressively pursuing even to the online components of sports betting.
And you had South Carolina jumping into it, which currently doesn't offer anything.
Just one thing I thought of, Attorney Stempeck, along with his expertise in online and sports betting, has also really delved into racing and has developed an expertise, since we do regulate racing. And our real source for good information is Racing Commissioners International, which I've attended conferences. Justin has as well, of course, Dr. Lightbaum. But at his suggestion this year, they've added a panel on sports betting, which he will be moderating and help put it together. And it's something they haven't spent a lot of time with yet, so they're very grateful for the recommendation and to share some of our information with regulators from around the country.
Right. Well, I saw that. I had suggested it just simply because I think there are some parallels to be drawn with racing and with our familiarity with racing and how we regulate racing in the Commonwealth. There's lessons to be learned there, particularly if there's a lot of ifs here, but if sports betting is allowed in the Commonwealth, and then we determine who gets it, and if it were to go to racing licensees, I think there's it's almost a natural marriage there. They've been doing this type of thing for a long time. They're familiar with advanced deposit wagering. They're familiar with an online component to their wagering system. So they have some expertise already in this area, which is worth pointing out and it's worth talking about. So I thought, particularly at a conference with racing commissioners from across the country and some from jurisdictions outside the United States, that's a conversation that should be, particularly when a lot of conversation is about trying to reinvigorate racing and keep it an active and vibrant community and get in some young people and everything like that, that if you can blend in sports betting with that, take advantage of their expertise on a type of sports betting on horse racing, you could really, there's an opportunity to make some hay there. No pun intended.
Yeah, no, the similarities to racing are really more than just incidental.
Right.
The notion about taxing the handle or takeouts from the handle, the notion about taxing GGR and how they've gone to the advanced deposit wagering are really important, really important parallels.
I do want to pull out one piece that you talked about that I think the public and the press might be particularly interested in. You make the distinction, and you've talked now about the difference between handle, which is the total amount of money that people bet, and the actual money, that percentage of that that's retained by the people who manage the betting. This is this so-called the rate, the commission, the takeout, which typically is around 5%. But when we hear these numbers about the billions that is gambled or hundreds of millions that's bet on the Super Bowl, I think people can tend to get stars in their eyes about the kind of revenue that's available. And your thoughtful estimates, which you are quick to say depend upon a million different variables, but I think the public might be interested in knowing that your estimates are that the range of revenues, the tax revenues that might come to the Commonwealth would be between $11 and $45 million a year.
Right.
That's not jump change, but that you also pointed out that Plainridge Park Casino, which is our smallest, only at the moment, but smallest casino facility, generated $81 million in tax revenue, twice almost the high-end projection. So while it's significant and it is something that people are very much involved in, the actual revenue potential for the Commonwealth is pretty modest. I think that's an interesting point that you brought out.
It's a hugely interesting point, important point, because not only does it impact a rational taxation schema, but also there's been a lot of discussion about integrity fees or whatever you might want to call it, that leagues may or have been asking certain state legislatures to put into legislation where they would get a piece of the handle to support not only increased monitoring, but increased investigations, et cetera. And, they've made the case that they view it to a certain extent as a royalty, right? Because they're offering up a product that people are then allowed to bet on. Someone's making money, in an indirect way off of their product. And the point we try and make in the paper is, because sports betting, unlike a lot of the other parts of casino betting and traditional betting, it's not as profitable. So anything you do that reduces that profit has an impact, downstream impact on the products that will be offered. And again, goes to impact that primary policy goal of getting people away from the illegal market, which right now is pretty robust and people are comfortable, and it's only getting easier with this online environment with pay-per-head model. And anyone can go online right now and Google online sports betting and probably place a wager illegally very easily. So you got to have to think these things through to make sure that we're maximizing the potential of getting people out of the illegal market.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Commissioner McDonald. I had a couple of comments and a question, I think primarily for Paul. First of all, I want to join in others' praise on the quality of the paper. I really think it's an excellent analytical piece that lays out in a very comprehensible fashion the major considerations that we ought to be taking into account. So it really is a very valuable accomplishment, and thank you both for doing it. The other comment that I wanted to make, and leading to a question, is to share my own understanding that I think it was the chairman's phrase that that the potential return to the state in terms of tax revenue is pretty modest here. And Paul, you referenced a first mover advantage concept with regard to the Commonwealth's or the legislature's and ultimately the governor's decisions with regard to this. I must say that my inclination on the subject has been that, given the relatively modest return to the state, that there would be no, in the event that the Supreme Court does declare PASPA to be unconstitutional, that there's no hurry to get into this, or there ought to be no hurry to get into this, and let other states, go first, and the Commonwealth in effect learn their lessons from this bevy of interest, which we're seeing reflected reflected specifically in the chart that you all prepared. Paul, do you think I'm off base on that? Do you think that there really is an important element here of first mover advantage, and that taking a wait and see position would be detrimental to the long-term interests of the Commonwealth?
Well, my personal opinion, and again, why we put in that comparison with the revenues that we're getting from Plainridge Park to really put it into context, that and the numbers that we use to project, kind of a limited environment to land-based only, was about 11 million, to an online and open environment was about 45, came from the Oxford study, which was the only study that we found that really broke down an analysis at a state level. So I think it's important. A first mover advantage is always real, I think, in terms of from the perspective of the operators. They'd like to get in, attract customers, really get a name out, brand it. And I think from the Commonwealth side, I don't know if at the state level, I think I tend to agree to an extent with you, Commissioner McDonald, that the advantages, I think, would be seen to the operators as a first mover more so than to the state, primarily because I think if it was a true budget balancer in terms of the revenues it brought in, then I might say something different. And again, $45 million is not insignificant at all, but I don't think it's going to make in a state like Massachusetts the difference between, you know, being able to do everything and not being able to do everything. So I think it really then speaks to when you look at it from those other policy perspectives of trying to, you know, get people right now who are in the illegal market, as Commissioner Cameron pointed out, not only without protection, but sometimes taken advantage of, the speed with which you would want to provide those protections to those people. I think then the burden kind of shifts in that regard to those are some of the policy perspectives that you're really going to advance first by being a first mover. But economically, the first mover advantages, I think, would clearly be to the operators who would be able to brand, market, start to get mind space of the customers quickly.
And Commissioner McDonald is its Executive Director Bedrosian. I had the fortune of tagging along with these two gentlemen as they did the hard work. So some of the things I heard on that were maybe a little less tangible, not necessarily tax revenue, but I would suspect down the line what we might hear from our brick and mortar licensees is if everyone around you has a sports book, it almost becomes a must-have. And while they recognize it's not a must-have on the revenue side per se, it's not a big revenue breaker for them, but certainly an amenity that becomes very important. And if you don't have it, what's the effect of not having that? The other thing I would note in the Commonwealth, we obviously have a very prominent DFS operator who's expressed interest in it. And it's just one of those issues I think the legislature, the governor, and our economic development people will think about in terms of trying to continue to have Massachusetts be a technology innovator, whether that is part of it or not. So I think there are intangible things that aren't necessarily measured directly in tax revenue. So I don't know if that actually helps the answer or clouds it up.
Okay, Commissioner McDonald, anything else?
Nope, thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? All right, great. Thank you very much,
Great.
folks.
Thank you.
Really
Thank
good
you.
work.
And
for the
Thank
work.
you.
as Justin said, anything else we can help with on this? we're
Well,
happy to-
we ought to think about, you know,
Yeah.
maybe
How to
just
advance it.
a cover. You know, I think it's really just an email, but if you might want to give me a draft of sort of bullet points or draft an email, how you would like to take in some of the points that Commissioner Zuniga made, I would take a look at that, and then I can sit down tonight or tomorrow and send them out.
Great.
Sure.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Congratulations. Great job. Director Driscoll, we're going to take a brief break here.
Yeah, when we do that, we can allow the other folks to set up too.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
We are reconvening public meeting 237 on March 1st at about 5 minutes of 11. Next item on the agenda is Ombudsman Ziemba. Let me just make sure that Commissioner McDonald, are you there and can you hear? Great, thank you. Ombudsman Ziemba.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, today we have the quarterly report for Plainridge Park for the fourth quarter ending December 31st. Presenting today as part of the Plainridge Park team are Ruben Warren, CFO, Kim Dixon, VP of HR, and Michelle Collins, VP of Marketing, Lance George, General Manager, and Lisa McKenney, Compliance Manager, are also here today. Ruben?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So for us, we are happy to report still finding our legs, but we're happy with business. Things are going well. And so for the fourth quarter, revenues, net slot revenues of $39 million. That's about 4.7% growth over 2016. And for the state taxes, $19 million to the state, or total taxes, 15.7 to the state, 3.5 to the racing industry.
When you say 19 for the state, are you talking about Racehorse Development Fund and the
Yeah.
two together?
The two-
Yeah, we think
two
of them as
combined,
both
19
tax
million.
revenues, right? Okay.
Correct. And for the year, $164.7 million total net slot revenues. It's about 6.3% growth over 2016. And for the total year, total taxes of just under $81 million, with 65.9 going to the state and 14.8 going to racing, to the racing industry.
Excuse me, just one second.
Yeah.
Lloyd, it seems like there's a noise in the background, maybe, or on the radio or something on your speaker. Commissioner McDonald?
You know what? There's a lag between the video and
Oh,
in
okay.
real time.
Right.
What
Oh,
I've done is I've muted the video.
Right, just mute.
And,
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I've had to wrestle with the same lag. All right, thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Michelle will get into a little bit about, some of the things that we're doing on property to sustain the growth, to get to know our customer better. And so we're pleased to report progress and growth year over year.
Is that anybody else questions? Is that it's a 6%? Did you say increase in
6.3% year over year.
Is that what you expected? Is that good, bad, or indifferent? What? How does that?
It's about what we expected. We are happy with the growth so far, and again, our jobs here is to continue to provide some excitement, try different things on the property. It's been a few years. We're getting our legs about the community, our customer base, and again, getting to know the customer. We're happy with where we are right now with the progress.
We've heard in the past 5 years to really have the most robust, where you feel like you're at the top of your game. Do you think that's about right?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think typically that would be the case.
You probably ought to come to a mic, Lance. Yeah, if you can.
Just change seats.
Just change seats for a second. Sorry. We don't want to miss any of your golden words.
I think traditionally that would be the case. However, for us, and it was alluded to earlier by Paul and Justin, changing landscape. We've got MGM opening. We'll have Wynn the year after that, and then we have Tiverton opening as well, which is about 40 minutes from us. So, whereas that used to be the case, I think with a changing landscape, a bit more challenging to look into the future.
Interesting. Yeah, good point.
So the next slide, lottery, still continues to be a great story for us. 822,000 in sales in the fourth quarter. It's about just under 10% growth over prior year. And for the year, just over $3.3 million in total sales through our instant ticket and online terminals. That's about a 12% growth. And talking to the lottery, they are managing the type of games that they put into our property specifically. That's different than what they do with the other lottery outlets that's around the city. And so I think with this, the growth we have seen, our cash business, lottery's a cash business, and I think it's a convenience factor that, people can come to the casino as they leave with a little money. They're going to go and, get their weekly lottery ticket. And so I think it's a great partnership for both.
Yeah, I was going to ask, that's a really significant growth. But you're thinking two factors. One is they're managing the products well.
Yeah.
And secondly, your patrons understand, or maybe every year they understand that this, more so, that they can take advantage of the product right there. Is that?
Yes. And so in our partnership with the lottery, we have dialogue in between to discuss what our patrons like, and they do a good job of creating new product. And so instead of going to the machine and seeing the same product, they do a great job of changing that out frequently. And so there's new things there every time that a customer comes up. Also, it's a convenience factor as they come in, entertain in the facility. There's a lottery machines there available for them. And so I think the state is a lottery state, and so people will play the games, but it's a convenience factor as well.
Yeah, oftentimes, and you guys have seen it in years past or quarters past, these numbers can be inflated because of marketing initiatives. But largely speaking, this 12% growth is organic, so sizable.
It's not bulk buys by you. It's just retail sales.
That's correct.
Largely.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Well, it's really. Do you have any experience, Lance, or anybody about lottery sales at other facilities around the country? Is this good, bad, or indifferent compared to others?
This is an anomaly.
Yeah, really.
Typically, it's flat and maybe a nominal increase, but a 12% year-over-year increase is an anomaly.
Yeah. and it's a credit to you guys and to the lottery, because as you know, everybody knows, the law mandated that we try to make a working relationship so that we wouldn't cannibalize the lottery.
Yeah.
And there's a second dimension to this, which is what has happened to lottery sales in the surrounding communities in Plainville. But previously, there in the 1 year study we've done, I think there's another one coming up pretty soon.
Yes.
There was very little. There was growth in the Plain Ridge and the Plainville and the surrounding communities. Maybe not quite as much growth as statewide, but it looks like taken together that it's going to, that lotteries is enhancing sales. I'm sorry, that the casino is enhancing lottery sales rather than the opposite the legislature was concerned about.
Sure, I think there were probably some concerns about cannibalization, at least in the surrounding communities, but that hasn't turned out to be the case.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned, I think, is also really good in terms of they themselves are figuring out the customer that comes to the casino and can play the lottery as well. And sounds like they're being really proactive in terms of keeping all of those games fresh. If they're limiting certain games to the casino and other places, maybe they can themselves sort out, what's the most competitive approach.
Great point. I think they're figuring out the casino customer as well.
Right.
Just for the record, Lance, as you well know, your facility has been a demo site for Massachusetts on a lot of things, including our learning our business. Never mind, the research and the problem gambling and the lottery relationship and everything else. And as you've heard me say, if there are problems, we will address the problems and we will talk about them. No questions about it. But from the very beginning, when your CEO agreed to participate in the Play My Way project, you guys have been willing to work with us and collaborate. I mean, you could argue that this money isn't going to slot machines, that could go into lottery, but notwithstanding that, you guys have really, in good faith, I think, worked with us to try to accomplish the goals that the legislature saw here. And it should not go unremarked. I know that it's not always easy with you guys, and it's put stress and strain on your organization and different kinds of pressures that not everybody who runs a casino has to deal with. So I just want to say for the record that that's noted and appreciated.
And we appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to state spend. And so for qualified spend for the fourth quarter, just under $2 million was spent, with 73% or just under 1.5 million staying in the state of Massachusetts. For the annual number, 6.7 million was spent and 75% stayed in the state of Mass. So I think that trend holds for us that 70 to 75% will spend inside the state. The next slide.
This is your spend, the spend that you've used on vendors.
Yours, correct.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
And that number's gone up kind of year to year, you're up. I don't think you have it. But
That I don't have.
okay.
Yeah, don't have the total year over year spend, but I could say on average, we keep about 70 to 75%. We spend that money in the state of Massachusetts. Yeah. The next slide is our hosting community and surrounding community spend. Just under 200,000 was spent in the fourth quarter. That's about 9% of our total overall spend. And for the year, $470,000, and that's about 70,000 was spent in our host communities. You can see that Plainville, we spent $141,000 in the fourth quarter, and that's mainly largely due to an LED lighting project. We procured a local electrician for that project, and so our approach to any procurement is we look at our host communities. We then look at if there's anyone that's qualified. We then move on to diversity. Is there anyone in that pool? And if there is, we stop there. If not, we'll cast a wider net and we'll do the same thing. And we will not exhaust the efforts until we move on to our diversity spend. And so the next slide, getting into diversity. For the total spend, 1.9 million in 2017. And 50% of that stayed in the state of Massachusetts of the diversity partners. 1.3 million for the women-owned category, just under 400,000 for the minority, and a little over 200,000 in the veteran category. And our next slide kind of shows the quarters, how we spend our funds in each quarter. Fourth quarter, of course, was the highest spend for us due to the projects, the LED lighting specifically. And so really not much here. The 200,000 was LED lighting in the women category, mainly marketing, promotions, and food and beverage services made up the bulk of the 400,000 there.
So do I read this right, that
Yep.
your total spend in 17 was close to 7 million, of which virtually 2 were diverse vendors?
That is correct.
So 2/7 of your total, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
Great.
Total qualified spend.
Total qualified, right?
Right. Good point. And so for the fourth quarter, overall, we hit our diversity goal. Our goal is 21%. We accomplished 39%. In the women category, the goal is 12%, and we were at 25%. In the minority category, the goal is 6%. We accomplished 12% of that goal. And for the veteran category, 3% was the goal, and we were just a little short. We're 2%. And so with that being said, we have done a lot of ground roots, back to the basics work to get out to the community, to the certain events, and figure out who's out there in the veteran category specifically, so that we can shore up that area. We have a project that's coming up late first quarter this month into April, and we have sourced veteran construction companies that we will be going out to, again, to give those companies an opportunity to bid on these projects. And so we feel like that's going to be shored up on an annual basis. We accomplished the goals across the board. So 28% on an annual basis for the overall spend, 19% for the women-owned category, above the 12% goal. We were right at the 6% goal for the minority and right at the 3% goal for the veteran category. So on an annual basis, we're meeting the goals. We just fell short in fourth quarter. The next slide, just an update on compliance. And so we checked just under 24,000 patrons in the fourth quarter. That's about 4% of the total patrons that walk through the door. Mainly it falls on your Friday, Saturdays, your busiest times.
What percent did you say?
4%.
4%.
And so 500 were prevented of the 24,000 from entering the building. Mainly that 78% makes up expired or no ID. So if we can't identify them, we send them away. And we had 90 that were underage that we turned away, 17 that were minors that we turned away. We did have in December 3 underage that made it onto the gaming floor, did not game, they did not consume alcohol. We quickly found out that we made a mistake and we got them off the floor.
This is something that I've noticed from these reports, and also from our IEB reports. There's virtually never an underage person that's gotten to the gambling machines or to drinking. That seems amazing to me that you would. I'm not sure that I've ever seen one. Maybe there's been 1 or 2 over the course of the last 2 years, but I don't remember actually seeing any. Is that unusual, or that seems to me to be pretty amazing?
Yeah, those numbers are really strong. I remember looking at those when we were doing our licensing with, and some of properties around the country certainly had higher numbers there. So I do think you're doing a very good job at identifying. And yeah, I was going to ask about that. You kept them. They might have gotten through, but not for long, right? You got them before they.
No. In my experience in other jurisdictions, we're doing a great job compared to some of the stories that you read. And so we take it very seriously. There's some very good training. We have a security director that we brought in from a different jurisdiction that's very aware, very experienced. And so, again, I think our property does a good job of making sure that we're monitoring who's coming through the door, and kudos to the team.
Do you guys know the approximate number of patrons that came through the doors in 2017?
We average about 200,000 in our off-peak, about 225,000 a month, or higher. May
And what's
through- May through
and just
July.
out of curiosity, to put it in perspective, Plain Ridge itself, the population of Plain Ridge itself is 8,000.
Yes.
Yes, 8,000.
And we do over 202 million, 2.5 million.
Yeah, that's remarkable. There's one of the things that I think is at play here is that you have a very favorable layout for entry. There's essentially just 3 entrances that are monitored every time I've been there. They're constantly monitored. That might not necessarily be the case in the property that's upcoming,
Sure,
and
sure.
we will see how
Yep.
those things pan out.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Kim Dixon for an employment update.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. As of the end of Q4, our total employees were 465. 308 of them are full-time, while 157 are part-time. We remain essentially the same with 62.2% as full-time and 33.8% as part-time. Our diversity number remains largely consistent at 23% on a 10% goal. We had a modest uptick with veterans at 5%, so it was up 1 percentage point over last quarter. Our overall male and female percentages remain the same. We had a lot going on in Q4 for recruitment. We continue to focus on our in-state and local hiring. A few highlights of what we did in Q4 where we attended the BCC job fair, the Recruit Military job fair. We had an on-site job fair. We placed several ads in the Sun Chronicle. We also have a link to the United Regional Chamber of Commerce's website where you can directly link to our site to apply for jobs. We also use their site to highlight some specific jobs we're looking for. We've built new relationships with Dean College as well as MTTI.
I'm impressed with some of the initiatives that you're taking. You know, the Massachusetts figure is one that has kind of stuck out. I went back and looked at where you were fourth quarter of the end of 2016. It was 70% Massachusetts. So everything else has stayed pretty flat, but that Massachusetts number, you know, has dropped a little bit. So, you know, whatever we can do or whatever some of the partners that stakeholder agencies that we work with can do to kind of help keep that number up. And I know Director Griffin would be happy to help you.
Yes, thank you. And she has.
You know, I had a question, maybe to the extent that you can speak to these, or at least in general. Have you seen your turnover decrease a little bit over time? How is that number?
Yes, so our number continues to get better over 2016 over 15 as well as 2017 over 16. So we're seeing that number drop.
Which is good news as far as
Yeah.
we're concerned, and then perhaps limits your ability to change a lot of these numbers
Exactly.
for obvious reasons.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to talk about, as Michelle mentioned at the last commission meeting, Women Leading at Penn is an initiative derived from the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook and former CEO of Google. The goals of our program, where Michelle and I are both co-chairs of the program for Plainridge Park, are to encourage women to pursue leadership roles, to have visible female executives and leadership, championing growth and development for women at their property, and to increase the number of women in leadership, specifically at the manager level, on an annual basis. So for all industries, women represent about 39% of management, while men represent 61%. Plainridge Park, we currently have about 36% women with 64% men. We are in line slightly below the industry, but we certainly do want to be better. And Michelle is going to walk us through the plans for Q1.
So what we're going to be doing is a timeline, and across all the Penn enterprise, each property will be doing the same initiative. So we're going to identify 15 participants, and these are women who are interested in pursuing management roles. They want to grow their career. We're going to look at hourly, salary, non-management, frontline employees, back of house, and help them develop. So the first thing we'll do after we identify those participants, and we'll have kind of a focus group, where we'll distribute this Lean In book, allow everyone to read it that's part of this group, and then we'll discuss it. And the book really highlights what the difference is between genders, and it gives women insight on how to succeed in the work industry. So I think really the main focus of the book, a quote that I took from the book that kind of says what it's all about is, it's time to cheer on girls and women who want to sit at the table. So it's kind of the underlying tone of what the book is about and how we'll develop these individuals.
How will you, what if you have more than 15 women that are interested in taking part in this course to be
So-
the next future leaders?
Yeah, so this is going to be a program through December, and then we'll do it again each year. So it allows opportunity across the board. We also want to identify those that aren't in a management role and be able to follow them through the process to see how well it's working and how they're developing. And as I mentioned, we're doing this at all the properties within Penn as well. So it allows for opportunity that maybe somebody who isn't in a management role at Plainridge Park could transfer over to another role within the Penn enterprise.
So you'll encourage, and you're going to be tracking the entire year.
Correct.
So yeah, I think the front end part is really important so that they can visualize themselves in a higher level position.
Exactly.
What is the follow-up? You know, is there a way, how do you stay in touch, keep track?
So we're going to be
reinforce?
meeting on a monthly basis, and there's a very detailed program
Okay,
throughout December of all the initiatives we'll be doing. So really March is the kickoff, and we'll start to develop and give the goals of the group, and then kind of have a baseline. And then from there, we'll offer different things that allows them to build their skill sets and to encourage them to grow within the industry.
In some months, we can address to a larger population as well to invite all women who may be interested in that particular topic that month.
great.
Well, I can think of one commissioner who might qualify to be a guest speaker in one of these
Yeah, no kidding.
sessions.
Yes,
if-
we will be
if she were
talking to you.
available.
Right.
No, this is encouraging
Yeah.
program because you would obviously, I know you're thinking about getting your numbers so where they're more equitable with women in leadership positions.
Mhm.
And Commissioner Cameron has had a lot of experience in leading such initiatives, and as is often called on to speak about this and to help mentor women, but also to help implement these kinds of strategies. So I'm sure she'd be willing to respond if you want.
That would be great.
Okay.
For local community, we attended the Taste of the Region, which is probably 100 or so restaurants in the local community that participate. The Mega Business Expo, our purchasing department attended this event to look for veteran-owned and minority-owned businesses. For Toys for Tots around the holiday season, we partnered with the lottery and the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling, and we did a toy drive. So as you can see in that picture, we had
Great.
over 500 toys that we were able to distribute, which was
Right.
nice.
How did you distribute them?
We collected everything, and then they deliver it to Toys for Tots, and then
Toys for Tots, okay, yeah.
correct. We partnered with the Clatta Fund and did a holiday charity event. For those of you who aren't familiar with Clatta Fund, they are associated with Dropkick Murphys. So we had our first Dropkick Murphys concert at the Loft, so that was exciting. And then we also participated in Be a Santa to a Senior. So this is based out of Attleboro. And we had about 100 gifts that we provided to the seniors. And it's really cute to see the tags because it's just little things like scarves and puzzles. So things that are very simple for us to get for them. And it was the employees that participated in that.
Nice.
For Q4 partnerships, most of this you see on this on a quarterly basis. So again, we continue with our Patriot Place partnership with the hotel stay and play packages. We've also started to utilize Holiday Inn in Plainville as well for a similar program. Rentham Village Premium Outlets, we are working with ballet, and as you can see in the picture here, it's the call to action that we put in the car with a bottle of water, and it has an offer on it for them to come back to Plainridge Park Casino. We continued with Nesson, Bruins, Celtics, and the Patriots. And we're really looking forward to moving on the Gaming Economic Development Fund opportunity. So we'll be incorporating the CVB, as you mentioned, and we're looking forward to that opportunity. I know we had mentioned maybe $50,000 of the fund to help us develop, so we're working with Paige on that now.
Great.
Q4 highlights. We did a Veterans Day meal where we served over 200 meals, free meals to veterans, local veterans. We had a New Year's Eve Mardi Gras theme. And in conjunction with the holiday event we did with Dropkick Murphys, we also hosted another boxing event.
Are you going to continue doing boxing events? Are they working for you?
Yes, we're going to look at one for possibly May.
Okay.
And then for Q1 highlights, as you know, we've been really focusing on the Loft, the entertainment, so we continue to do comedy shows. We recently did Mike Gerard's Swing Band, which was different, but again, a nice turnout. A lot of last minute sales for that one. And then Bob Marley and Frank Santos Jr. Come on a quarterly basis now. Yeah.
Great. Great. That it?
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Thanks. A lot of progress, a lot of initiatives that are interesting, and thank you for the good work.
Just to note, there's a big seafood show happening up at the Boston Convention Center, so send Eli or F&B people to come
Good
up
fit
and
with
see
slacks,
what
yeah.
else they can buy from Massachusetts vendors.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
Take a quick break while Mark sets up. You are going to go to item number 4. Mark, you're going to start with Christopher rather than the framework?
That's correct. Just a little switch in the order of my items. I thought we would have Christopher go first with the crime report, followed by the framework and National Problem Gambling Awareness Month, which both of those kind of couple together very well. So good morning, commissioners. I am joined here with Christopher Bruce, a crime analyst working on behalf of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission as part of our research agenda. Commissioners, as you know very well, there's been a number of studies produced over time that take a look at the effects of gambling on serious crime rates. But hardly any of these studies have attempted to analyze more specific and minute changes in public safety activity following the opening of casinos. And by this, I mean evaluating it as closely as by hour, by month, by season, changes in patterns and hotspots, changes in non-crime activities such as collisions and calls for service. But these are exactly the types of questions that when the Massachusetts Gaming Commission contemplated this project, these are the ones that we wanted to have answered. And why is that? It's because for the very reason we want this data to be useful. We want to provide a level of detail that would directly help the local police agencies anticipate problems before they become bigger problems and respond to emerging and changing issues. Today, Christopher Bruce is going to present to you the 2-year report. That is 2 years following the opening of Plain Ridge Park Casino. Preceding this, we had publicly released reports at 3 months, at 6 months, at 1 year. We provided data to local police agencies at 18 months. All with this attempt. We want to anticipate and we want to respond should there be issues that arise. This report we're excited to offer to you to publicly release. It's the most comprehensive report yet. By comprehensive, I know that Christopher is going to do an excellent job of reviewing the finer details of this report and any issues that the commission as well as our local agencies should be aware of. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. It's good to be here again. We just heard from the Plain Ridge Park itself that they're receiving about 7,000 visitors per day, which effectively doubles the population of Plainville during the time that those visitors there at the casinos. So I think my summary goes along really well with that, because the types of activity that we saw increase from a police perspective in the Plainville area is very much the type of activity that you would expect to increase with large influx of additional people on a daily basis. The people who on their way in or out stop at gas stations, stop at stores, and lose their telephones, lose their driver's licenses, need directions, lock themselves out of their cars, and then cause some additional traffic issues along the routes in and out of the community. And that's mostly what we saw increase among the 6 communities that participated in this project. Overall crime dropped in the 6 communities, and property crime especially was down. I'll talk a little bit about that. Violent crime was up a little bit, but not in a way that we could trace in any way to a Plain Ridge Park influence. Most of what did increase were calls for service, non-criminal calls for service, lost property, general service, reports from the community of complaining about traffic issues, complaining about suspicious vehicles or other types of suspicious activity. If there had truly been anything criminal with that activity, that would have resulted in more crimes. So it was more of just community concerns that we saw there. And a couple of criminal issues that we took a look at, including credit card fraud, but generally speaking, most of the increases were in the area of traffic and general calls for service. During the period, some of the agencies that we were working with hired new people, hired a couple of crime analysts, got new people in charge of coding their data, which created some difficulties analyzing it, because they actually improved the way that they were reporting certain crimes, especially in North Attleboro, but that they did so in a way that made their current data inconsistent with their past data, and so we had to overcome that a little bit. So that's the general summary of what happened. So these are the 6 communities you can see on the screen. Plain Ridge Park annotated there as the dot, and all 6 of these communities contributed incident level calls for service and crime data to our study, not just statistics, but specific information about each and every event that they had responded to for the 5 years before Plain Ridge Park opened and the 2 years after Plain Ridge Park opened. Dates, times, demographics of the people involved, types of property stolen, types of vehicles involved. This allowed for, as Mark indicated, a much greater depth of analysis of what had changed than we could have done if we had simply gotten raw statistics, which is what most previous studies have done. So I took the data out of their different individual records management systems and computer-aided dispatch systems, merged them into a common database, and compared what happened in the various periods after Plain Ridge Park opened to the years before. Anything that significantly increased, I took a careful look at with all of the available data, plus some of the data they didn't provide initially, but allowed me to access on scene, such as police officers' narratives and more personal identifying information. And so in the report itself, which you have in front of you, everything that was above a certain threshold, I offer an explanation for why I think that category increased or during the period. Most of the time it was untraceable to Plain Ridge Park, but you can see the few cases in which it was. My report was reviewed by your own research advisory committee. That was extremely helpful, and they had some very good comments that I incorporated into the final one, and as well as the local police chiefs. We had our usual meeting of those chiefs, gave them an opportunity to comment, to object, to offer any additional context, and those comments were also included in the final report. And I'll say here that there has been really no controversy at all, I think, in working with the local chiefs. They've been in agreement with just about all of the conclusions that I've come to. They've they provided some very helpful context, but we've had no real disagreements where I've said that something was related and they didn't think so, or vice versa. And so that's been a very positive experience working with them.
Can I just interject there?
Yeah, sure.
I think a lot of that, Christopher, is due to your the work that you've done with these chiefs and their staff to make your work valuable to them. I think has been tremendous.
I hope so.
Yeah, and I think it's led to some of those communities sometimes with surrounding community monies, hiring crime analysts.
Yes.
This has brought great value, and I think they enjoy the dialogue. You know, what do you think? What do you think? And that's my my favorite part of the whole project. But I think you've brought that added value to them. They see that, and that's made this very
Well, thank
successful.
you. I certainly hope so. So with many of the crimes that we're dealing with, and especially in terms of the calls for service that don't rise to the level of criminal activity, we don't often know who the perpetrator is. We're talking about, and I'm not saying Plainridge, the Plainville area has a unique issue with this nationally. Crimes like burglary, thefts from vehicles, robbery, etc., have detection rates in the low double digits. So, between 10 and 20% of the time that do we solve it, do we actually know who committed the crime? Because of that, we don't have a lot of direct evidence for this offender had any kind of casino or gambling motivation or was in the area to use the casino. So in order to compensate for that, I had to develop a number of sort of indirect methods to try to determine that there might be a casino relationship in play. I sort of developed a rubric that you can see on the screen and is explained further in the report of different ways that we could look at the circumstantial evidence and still determine that there might be a relationship to Plainridge Park or indeed any casino in the future using this rubric. And I won't go through all of these, but you can see the various categories here. So, obviously, if the crime has to have a logical connection to the casino, there's certain crimes that there would be no, even if a person was gambling motivated, you wouldn't expect them to commit that particular type of crime. If we saw more offenders or victims coming from outside the area, that's a good sign, even if they don't explicitly say, or we don't know that they were in the area to use Plainridge Park. If we see the same category increasing across multiple agencies, that's a better sign than if only one agency reports an increase. If we see similar crimes increasing together, is a better sign than if only one increases out of a pack of a bunch of offenses that are very much the same. We look for spatial relationships, although that's not as important in Plainridge Park, where it's right off the highway and there's no local public transportation or foot traffic to the casino. That's going to be a lot more important in the MGM project, I think. And then I looked at statistics statewide as well as in the Plainridge area. I can only do that for crime, unfortunately, not calls for service. But still, if things increase in the Plainville area, but not anywhere else, or not in the control communities, that's obviously better evidence that there's a casino relationship. The comparison communities are listed there. I looked for groups of communities of a similar composition, similar population, similar crime rate, off highways with some retail presence in addition to its residential population.
What's the IBR total?
I'm sorry, IBR stands for incident-based reporting. That's their crime total for 2014 that was the year that I had the statistic for when I established the comparison areas to begin with. So, that's the sum of their serious crimes. Comparison area 1 got a Cabela's Sporting Goods during this period, so that threw off their numbers a little bit. But overall, the comparison areas provided a good way to look at what happened in Plainville versus some similar sized communities.
And you say that this is apparent that they're right in line. There's not they're right there with what other communities, similar size communities, as far as their crime rates.
Yes, exactly. So just quick notes on previous research. As we've emphasized several times, almost all previous research in this area has been done based on aggregate statistics, just totals, generally based on Part 1 crimes as reported to the FBI every year. And it's very limited data. It doesn't get into the specific of, you get all larcenies, for instance, without being able to separate out thefts from vehicles, shoplifting, thefts from buildings, pocket picking, and so forth. And without having any more specific data to work with other than the total. So I can tell you through the UCR data that robbery went up 20% somewhere, but I can't tell you what types of offenders are involved, what types of victims are involved, where physically they happened, and so forth. And that's a difference with this study, because we're getting that data. We're getting that detail from these agencies. Studies in previous research have been extraordinarily mixed when it comes to the impact of casinos on crime. in the surrounding communities. Some find that it increases, some find that it doesn't. Some, even the ones that find that it increases, find that different crimes increase. And they might increase initially and then drop off, or they might not increase at all and then increase in third, fourth year down the road. They're very different, but I think it all has to do with the variances in the casinos themselves and in the geography in which they're located. And so here we're going to have a chance to study three very different types of casinos and three very different geographies. And it's going to be interesting to see how the studies compare after we've had a chance to look at MGM and whatever win ends up being called.
Christopher, I was going to save this for later, but since you just brought this up, this seems to me to be, and it always has struck me, this is a really labor-intensive project. Are you staffed up, or how do you going to do this?
Mark keeps asking me that. Like, I understand that's a concern. No, I mean, yeah, but by 2021, you know, you're going to be my full-time employer practically. But but I have the bandwidth to accommodate it. Yeah.
Okay.
As things are ramping up with the different casinos opening in Massachusetts, some of my other contracts are dropping off. So
Right.
I'm definitely prioritizing this work.
Okay.
And if I need to, yeah, I'll get assistance to help me.
Right.
Thank you for asking that question as well.
Well, and also, I think you and Commissioner Cameron have been working with, I don't know about Everett yet, but certainly with Springfield
Yeah.
and the surrounding communities. How is that going to
It-
prepare those relationships?
It's going very well. They're on board and already contributing data for the baseline study. So
Right.
I've already collected data from 8 of the 12 participating communities, and the others are just a matter of scheduling.
Right.
So I haven't had any serious concerns about participation from any of them so far.
Yeah.
And this is a deliverable that we expect to have
Yeah.
before the commission by the end of the fiscal year. So by June 30th, we'll have that out and done.
That meaning the baseline?
The baseline for Springfield and the surrounding communities.
Right.
The kickoff meeting up there, all of the surrounding communities, host community, they all participated. The room was full. Most of them had already checked with the communities down in the Plainville area, because that's what cops will do, and just to see what it's like. Is this something I should participate in? So we had a really good group willing to participate, and certainly Christopher's reputation precedes him, and you know, the value add to these, especially some of the smaller surrounding communities that may not have the money to have their own crime analyst.
Yeah.
Certainly Springfield has a number of them, and
Yeah.
you know, they're a large agency, but all of them are willing, and if there's one or two that we'll work on it. But yeah, I think that's well underway, right? The baseline, and you're
Yes.
not having issues so
No,
far.
I'll
Yeah.
I'll let you know if I do, but no, it's been very smooth
Great.
so far, and that is a huge difference. Springfield itself, the police department has a very large crime analysis unit. They're very well resourced, well trained, and they're going to be able to participate in this project in a way that, you know, Plainville, being as small as it is, just can't justify that
Right.
type of position. So the major findings are that, as I said earlier, violent crime was up in the area of property, and total crimes were down. And I'll talk about violent crime. I don't think it's related to Plain Ridge Park at all, and neither do the chiefs in the area. The casino itself, it had a number of incidents, of course, and the statistics are offered in the report in terms of thefts and you know, incidents of drunk patrons and so forth. But overall, that led to a 10% increase in property crime and a 12% increase in total crime in Plainville itself. Again, that's exactly at the casino, right? Not considering anything that's happening in the surrounding community. A 0% increase in violent crime, though there's virtually none at Plain Ridge Park in terms of assaults and robberies and so forth. It's all property crime and you know, disorderly and so forth. Throughout the region, total arrests have been really significantly down, and that has partly to do with some changes in the way that local agencies are applying protective custody statute to effectively arrest people if they're intoxicated until they're no longer a danger. But even if you control for that, the arrests in the area are pretty significantly down. The things that I thought were likely related to the presence of Plain Ridge Park included a increase in credit card fraud during the first year, although it did not persist into the second year, traffic collisions on the feeder routes to the casino, and then a bunch of calls for service in Plainville itself that are related to just a lot of extra people in town, as I said earlier. Lost property, suspicious activity, traffic, and parking complaints. We saw a general increase in activity at the types of places that you would expect people to stop at or stay at in the area. So the crime increased at hotels, convenience stores, and gas stations. Although when it only tripped a threshold when you consider crime in totality. If you start looking at individual crimes, none of them really individually tripped any threshold. But so there's just obviously more activity at these types of places. Probably more people staying in the area, more people stopping for gas and so forth. But it didn't manifest itself in particular crimes, just sort of a total increase in activity at those types of locations. This chart shows just total violent crime and total property crime. You can see that property crime plummet there: burglaries, auto thefts, thefts from vehicles. And I don't think it's real. Somebody asked me at one of the chiefs meetings, is this related to the extra police presence in the area, because we have more state police and so forth, more local police in Plainville itself. But that seems to mirror Massachusetts as a whole. The state had a really good 2016 and 2017 when it came to property crime, and Plainville benefited from that. Same as
I
every
think
place else.
two concerns that the chiefs opined about. One was the violent crime.
Yeah.
They really thought that was opioid related.
They did, yeah.
That was many of them, and they had specific examples of that.
Right. As I'm going to talk about, it seems to be domestic violence that's increasing in the area.
Mhm.
And there's a drug concern with that. There's economic overall economy concerns that the chiefs have voiced. It's really tough to tie that type of increase to a specific cause. But I did an exhaustive search of narratives for anything like the words gambling, Plainridge, casino, anything like that, and just that's not showing up in any of the reports. Let me cover that a little bit more in a second.
Sure.
Okay.
Just the other issue that at least one chief opined about was the traffic, and what the chief thought there was the traffic apps like Waze have really, they're taking people off 495 and pushing them to Route 1 or other back roads, which has increased so that was a very interesting observation and something I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. And I won't be able to be sure on traffic collisions until I look at some statewide data with comparison areas for the same period. Again, I'll talk about that in just a second. These are just some examples of the numbers that you'll find in the report. There's tables and tables and tables in the report for each agency for the sum of the total agencies. So I'll leave you to peruse that. But some of the important things to gather from this are the types of crimes that people really are concerned might increase in the area. Following the opening of a casino, like burglary and thefts from vehicles and robberies did not increase at all. In fact, went down quite significantly in some cases in the area. And what did increase, at least as you can see on this chart, simple assault, credit card fraud, and overall traffic collisions. And you might remember my previous lessons on this, but anything between -1 and +1 would be totally normal. Between lower than -1, higher than +1, you start to get into this is slightly unusual, but not anything to be alarmed at area. And once it trips -2 or increases above +2 for the Z-score, that's when things are really unusual. Things have changed a lot compared to what their normal fluctuations are. And so I kind of use that. I use -1.75 or +1.75 as my threshold for when I really started to analyze a crime in much more detail, but not very much tripped that threshold in the positive direction when it comes to traditional types of crimes that people are worried about. Compared to the rest of the state, there are only three things that flagged really. So Plainville kind of followed statewide trends, and this is just for the 18-month period after it, because the 2017 wasn't available yet from the state. But domestic-related crimes, as I said, went up in the area, and that manifested in the kidnapping and simple assault increase. Those kidnappings, it's very low numbers, but the increase was all domestic-related, confining situations where a victim was confined as part of a fight, and they charged it with kidnapping as part of that. The only one that wasn't domestic-related that significantly was different in the Plainville area versus the rest of the state was, I'm sorry, versus the control communities was credit card fraud, which I'll talk about in just a second. As far as Plain Ridge Park itself, and this is something I'm sort of doing on the side in these reports. I was contracted mostly to analyze what happens in the surrounding community, but the state, the Gaming Enforcement Unit has been providing me the statistics for the casino itself, so I was happy to include those in the report. And you can see some of the different trends that we've seen there. When I say at least, that
What's the period of time?
this is for the 2 years. Yes.
Oh, this is the 2 years.
Yep. The numbers themselves are actually a bit higher. What happens is they give me the statistics and then they write a little narrative when something is uniquely notable or when an arrest is made. And so by reading those, I get a sense of what some of the trends are. But for the ones they didn't write any narrative on, I don't know exactly what happened. So when I say at least, it means there were that many narratives that supported that particular trend. But there could easily be double that total number if I had a report on every single crime. Excuse me. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing specifically at the casino that are being responded to by the Gaming Enforcement Unit as well as casino security and the Plainville Police Department.
Would you agree that those numbers are not high for a 2-year period?
No, I'd say that they're about commensurate with a similarly, any facility that draws 7,000 people a day. If it was a Walmart or what am I thinking? Movie theater.
You're right.
Couldn't think of the right term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, similar size.
You'd see very similar, statistics. The trends are obviously a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Casinos are the only places you can steal Tito tickets and so forth. But generally speaking, we'd see similar property crime and probably higher violent crime numbers at a place at any facility that draws thousands of people a day. Yeah.
Probably the only place you can damage a machine by spilling a drink.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Christopher, what you have one of the notes here, the high solvability rate, especially in the Tito. Is that generally true for some of the other categories?
Is it for
the high solvability?
I mean, the high solvability rate is largely just because of the surveillance they have at the facility. Right. So when anybody reports that they had something stolen, they can go back to the cameras, they can identify who did it, they can trace that person out to the garage, they can follow their car. I mean, they know everything about the person, within 45 minutes. So.
I don't know that all other facilities have the ability to do the legwork that we've done. Meaning, they see the camera, they see the individual, they see them in the garage, they get the license plate. They've followed up by actually going to a residence. Right. I mean, they've done that level of work where I'm just not sure that Atlantic City did not have that kind of staff that they could follow up to that extent.
Yeah. If any criminals are watching, listening to this, committing a crime at a casino is really, really dumb. Don't do it because of that very reason. Yeah. Okay. On Plainville itself, if the physical facility, that exact address hadn't been there, they'd be looking at 10% fewer property crimes and 12% fewer total crimes for the year. But here's your comparison to some of the other top call for service locations in the area, and you can see they vary depending on the nature of the location and the types of customers they get and what you can even do there. But generally speaking, Plain Ridge Park is now the number one call for service location for the Plainville Police Department, but it's about the same as the number one call for service locations for other communities in the area. In fact, for Rentham, the village outlets pretty much dominate everything that they get there. And it's about the same as what they were doing at Plainville Commons, which was their number two locations. It's a shopping center close to Plain Ridge Park before Plain Ridge Park opened. So it's they got a 36% increase in sworn officers at the Plainville Police Department in anticipation of the casino opening, and they had a 12% increase in total crime. So I think the ratio worked out fairly well for them in that regard. On credit card fraud specifically, I had reported last year that it had increased, and indeed it did for the first year. It was up almost immediately after Plain Ridge Park opened. It persisted being high for the year, and then it dropped in the second year. So it's a trend that did not continue. I still think that there was probably a relationship there. That doesn't mean you can have temporal trends and that don't continue, but my conviction comes from the types of locations that the stolen credit cards were being used and the types of things that were being bought, and in the fact that the other areas of the state and then the comparison communities didn't have the same increase. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence there, and I think what was happening was people were coming up to use the new casino, and bringing stolen credit cards with them. I'm not talking about a lot of people. The total number is a few dozen over a 2-year period, so it's enough to trip the thresholds, but not like the cities are being ravaged by this epidemic or something like that. But during that period, we saw a lot of use of stolen credit cards to purchase food, liquor, gift cards, cigarettes, things like that for short-term use. And so my hypothesis was people were coming from out of town, bringing the cards with them as part of their their weekend stay, using them to purchase things like food and liquor, and saving their money for use at the facility itself. Whether I'm right or wrong, it didn't continue, and so we'll keep monitoring that. But it was a short-term trend, even if it was related specifically to Plain Ridge Park.
Pleased it didn't continue.
No, right.
That's a good.
Do I remember correctly, though, that the chiefs disagreed with you on that? That they felt
Disagree
like
so much as I think they just did.
They had no evidence.
Like I could, yeah, like as in my case, I couldn't identify a specific offender that was clearly there for casino reasons. But again, we're talking about a crime that we only know about 5% of who the offenders are. So it's a tough one to ever attribute motive to a specific offender. Each individual agency would have only seen an increase of maybe a dozen incidents per year, so one a month. I mean, that's not something that's going to trip any radars at each police station. It only comes into focus when you're looking at the data across multiple communities across a multi-year period.
Right. Chris, really quickly on this slide, and maybe it was just me, I didn't quite understand the labeling of it. It's illegal credit card use.
Yes.
Just those types of purchases out of
This
overall.
one is just for those types of purchases.
Okay. Out of overall illegal.
Out of all legal credit cards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
in the 6 communities, right?
Now, when it comes to traffic collisions, we saw a modest increase pretty much almost every month throughout the 2-year period in the area, as well as on the state roads leading into the area. You can see by the chart here that the increase actually started before Plain Ridge Park opened in January and February of 2015. But you also might remember that was that year that we had that awful winter, and that increase is basically just like 2 days that had snow in the middle of the day and just caused widespread collisions. So if I had controlled for those, it wouldn't have been such an increase earlier in the year. Anyway, this is an area where, unless you're from North Attleboro or certain places in Attleboro, Google Maps is going to route you up 95 to 495 and then right off the exit to the casino. So it doesn't surprise me that we didn't see a much bigger increase in traffic collisions in the area, because local roads generally aren't, I don't think, being taken to the casino, although we'll only know that from a traffic study. So it makes sense to me that it was just a slight increase for most months as the year went by. And here you see it by hour of the day. And this kind of makes sense to me too. It follows sort of not so much patterns of when the casino is open, but patterns of when extra traffic coming to use the casino might conflict with commuting traffic in the area on a daily basis. Anyway, you see the biggest spike there in the 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. hour. When people are trying to get home, and then other people are coming into the community to make use of the casino. Again, this is all hypothesis at this point, but it logically makes sense to me that you would see this particular pattern, given the extra traffic coming to the area. And the state police reported I don't have enough past data from them to establish a good baseline, but just compared to the previous couple of years, there was enough of an increase on state roads that I think it makes sense. We've got an extra 7,000 cars a day. Some of them are going to occasionally get involved in accidents or disrupt traffic patterns enough that you're going to see that. However, I'm currently right now in the process of collecting data from the State Department of Transportation for the period ending 2016. That they don't close their data sets for a while after the year ends. But with that data, I'll be able to look at comparison areas to see if the increase is unique to Plainville or if it's something the local chiefs have repeatedly said is probably just related to extra driving in general, or perhaps the Waze phenomenon that Commissioner Cameron talked about. So I'll be able to reach stronger conclusions about traffic collisions with that study, which will be completed this year. And there's the state police statistics you can see again. 2017 was quite a bit higher than the previous years. Now, some things that I don't think were Plain Ridge Park related, but that we reported to the communities about so that we could help them intercede, regardless of whether they had anything to do with the casino, includes increases in fraud in general. I'm talking about con games. There was especially an increase in telephone-related fraud, people calling up pretending to be from the IRS, from your credit card company, for representing family members in trouble, things like that. And there isn't any logical reason that would increase in these surrounding communities specifically, even if it was casino related. But the fact is that category has been increasing all over the state and in the comparison areas as well. And same with identity theft and identity fraud. Those categories are fast increasing across the nation, really. And so I don't, even though the increase in the Plainville area was quite significant, it didn't outpace the control communities, and I don't think that there was a relationship to Plain Ridge Park. Domestic assault and what we call family offenses, which include things like violations of restraining orders or child neglect, increased in the 6 communities, and they did increase in the 6 communities in a way that was higher than in the control communities and in the state as a whole. And we're very sensitive to the idea that problem gambling could cause things like domestic violence and increase in domestic disputes and so forth, but we just don't see any evidence of it in any of the cases. And unlike other types of crime that I talked about, this is a type of crime where we generally have detailed information about all the participants, and we know what their specific motivations were, what prompted a specific fight, or what types of issues the family is having. These show up in the narratives. And I searched them all, 3 of the communities. I searched literally every single report that they had of domestic violence for the 2 years. The other 3, I took a sample and searched them, and not in a single one could I find anything that had anything to do with gambling, casinos, that type of relationship. And we'd expect that evidence, that flag, to show up in at least a couple, if there was any kind of relationship between gambling and the increase in domestic violence. So. I don't think it's Plain Ridge Park related. The chiefs believed that it was more of just a general economic trend. There's a strong correlation generally between domestic violence and the way that an economy is progressing, and the opioid problem as well came up as an explanation. I hesitate to offer those as alternatives without stronger evidence,
Right.
but what I can say is that there's no evidence of a gambling relationship in that.
But this is the added value that I spoke about earlier. It doesn't have anything to do with the casino, but the chiefs get to sit around and say, okay, what do we think? What are you seeing? And also the miscoding, it gives an opportunity to clean up some of the coding, which is just,
That's been a problem.
it helps everyone understand the issues better.
And also Rentham had a big increase in activity at the premium outlets, including additional incidents of shoplifting, theft, and fraud. But that seemed to be related to reporting practices at the outlets themselves, and not tied to the casino. And I think that just a chart showing how assault has been increasing. So the fact that it's been increasing so much at residences rather than non-residences suggests more of a domestic relationship. So upcoming, obviously we're working on MGM right now and collecting the data for the baseline report. We'll be presenting a 30-month report to the police chiefs after April of this year, just to keep them updated on any new trends that might have cropped up in the past 6 months. I'm going to be providing some training to the agencies that are participating in this project, sort of as a way to to thank them and reward them. But the connection that I use to get the data out of their systems can also be used by them to get their own data and ask any number of questions of it that might be casino related or non-casino related. And so I'm going to train them in those techniques in a class coming up in May. We'll have the MGM baseline study in June, as well as the traffic study for Plain Ridge Park. And then throughout the year, we'll have to obviously do the kickoff meeting for the Everett Casino. We'll have the 3-year report for Plain Ridge Park at the end of the year, and then the 90-day report for MGM about a year from now. Any other questions for me? Comments?
No, just really well done, and I think we're lucky to have you on our team, frankly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thank
I
you very
agree.
much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you,
good stuff.
Christopher. Thank you, Mark. We'll have a quick break while you get set up. All right, we are reconvening public meeting 237, I think it is, at about 12:05. And we are back to Director Vanderlinden.
All right.
Oh, excuse me, Commissioner McDonald, I neglected to ask if you had any follow-up questions for Christopher Bruce. I assume you would have spoken up if you did.
Well, I actually did, but it was too late.
I'm
so
sorry.
Not to worry.
My apologies. I'm sorry. That was my fault. But yell out if you need to get our attention. Okay, Director Vanderlinden.
Okay, great. I am joined with Teresa Fiore, who's our program manager for research and responsible gaming, and of course, Marlene Warner, the executive director of the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling. We have 2 agenda items for you that I think kind of go together very well. The responsible gaming framework, followed by March 1st is the kickoff of National Problem Gambling Awareness Month. So first, the framework. The 4 commissioners here are very well aware of the journey that we've been on to explore this area of responsible gaming and to ultimately build the original responsible gaming framework. It kicked off in 2013 when we hosted a responsible gaming forum, brought in a number of academic, policy, and advocacy experts. That followed by an extensive search of relevant research that could inform a framework. We employed the expertise of Dr. Jeff Murata of Problem Gambling Solutions. We certainly, as we always do with any item of importance, we seek out the feedback of the public. We seek out the feedback of, well, at that time, were our applicants, not licensees yet. The Responsible Gaming Framework, the original, was adopted in 2014. I don't think I understood the value of that framework in 2014, and it's only been over the course of the past 4 years that I think I truly appreciate that. What the framework has done is it's set a rock-solid foundation for our orientation of how we value responsible gaming, not just responsible gaming in this sort of very sort of one plane approach of responsible gaming is up to the individual, but this very multidimensional understanding of responsible gaming that is our responsibility, it's our licensee's responsibility, it's the individual who chooses to gamble, their responsibility. That sort of orientation that's outlined in the framework, I think, is incredibly powerful. It makes it incredibly clear as well to our licensees that we see this as a partnership, not as putting the responsibility squarely on one individual or entity. The Responsible Gaming Framework also led to I think, a number of powerful and very important programs that have spawned out of that. The Game Sense program that is run by the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling as a key partner with us. Play My Way as a budgeting tool that is the first of its kind in the nation. And our voluntary self-exclusion program. And while voluntary self-exclusion isn't necessarily unique, our approach to how we value that and how we approach it, I believe, is incredibly unique. All of these strategies, all of these tactics are open for debate that were in the first version of the responsible gaming framework. The framework was intended to be flexible as we as a commission learn as additional evidence becomes available, as we seek out and value additional feedback along the way. And so it was in December of 2016, we said, let's reopen this. Let's take a look at the work that has been done. Let's engage this process once again to begin building a version 2 of this framework. We did some I think really important stuff in this. We sought out, for example, the feedback of additional groups. I believe it was at the suggestion of Marlene, who said, why don't you seek out the advice of the recovery community, individuals that have been profoundly impacted by problem gambling. Ask them what they think about this framework and get their thoughts about what could have been different for them, what could have been in place that would have made a difference for them. I think that was one of the more incredible and powerful meetings that we had leading up to this version 2. We went back and opened up our examination of the additional research that is out there. We went to our licensees who were applicants, now licensees, and we sought their feedback. We took it to the Public Health Trust Fund Executive Committee, who in 2013 and 14 was not assembled at that point. At this point, they're a powerful voice in terms of a public health approach to responsible gaming, and set the priorities of the Public Health Trust Fund that's under the Gaming Commission, or under the Expanded Gaming Act. I'm sorry. That's the overview. We continued to work with Dr. Jeff Murata. We had a very fantastic steering committee that included Marlene and Teresa, Commissioner Zuniga, and again, Dr. Jeff Murata. I wasn't sure what would come from it back in December of 2016. Whether I liked the framework a lot, but and I continued to find it very useful. But I guess that's the point where you should probably it's still a good time to crack it open. We found a lot. We made a number of revisions, and I present to you a memo with all of the revisions. I won't go through every single one, but if I may just provide for you the highlights of the changes that we made. We introduced the concept of positive play, and we integrated that throughout the framework. Where we talk about responsible gaming is really how services, the provision of gaming services, and doing it in a way that values responsible gaming. Positive play is more of a focus on the player and what attributes that player has that would lead them to a path where they do not experience harm. And so what does that look like? It goes hand in hand with this concept of low-risk gambling guidelines, which our Sigma or Magic team are taking a close look at. And I'm excited to integrate positive play into the framework. I'm also very interested in the learnings that we will receive from the cohort study that will lead us down this path of understanding what low-risk gambling guidelines look like. We introduced the concept of the stepped care approach as a guiding principle through the framework. That goes hand in hand with the informed decision-making model that we used and relied on heavily in version 1. And finally, it's this idea of how are we encouraging innovation, not just from us, but from our licensees. And I think that was clearly on display, was that last month, when the commission said, we're going to move forward with Play My Way, but we want to do that in partnership with our licensees, not handed down as a regulation, but in partnership. And part of that, I think, is I think it will create some challenges, but I think one of the powerful pieces of that direction is that it will allow a more, hopefully foster a more innovative approach to doing so. And we carry that through and forward in the responsible gaming framework. There are a number of other changes, not least of which is the pretty amazing look of the new framework, by which I want to call out our Mike Sangalang, who I think his skills in this area are on fine display through the way that it's been reformatted. So thank you, Mike. I guess at this point, rather than kind of taking it step by step or strategy by strategy, I thought I would open it up for feedback and suggestions. But if you would like me to kind of walk through strategy by strategy, I could certainly do that as well.
Well, it might be helpful just to point out some of the improvements from the first version.
Yeah.
Let me, could I just, before you do the point by point, I had two kind of overview questions that I wanted to, or issues I wanted to put out there to hear from you, and then we can do that, Commissioner. One is there's a lot of discussion and sometimes criticism of the model of the informed consent model, or sort of paradigm, because it suggests that the responsibility lies with the consumer, with the player, not with the licensee or with the operators, and that it's sort of a cop-out on, yeah, you give them a lot of information, but then it's up to them, you cut them loose, and there's no real burden on the operators. You know, how do you speak to that and rationalize where we've come down and how you walk that line?
I would say, you know,
Marlene too, if you're interested.
Right. Not all information is presented equally. You could put a brochure out at a cage that talks about the probability and odds, and you could, in essence, be accomplishing that informed consent. But is that useful, and are you truly providing that information in a way that people will use and digest and inform their gambling decisions? We took the approach of, let's think about this in a number of different ways to create this informed consent, to provide information in a way that people digest and they use as they walk onto the gaming floor and make that decision. So that the buck stops with the individual that sits down at a machine or sits down at a table, but I think we all have a shared responsibility of making sure that it's available in locations that make sense. Make sure that the content of what's being presented is in a way that rings true with the individual that's reading it. Making sure that you do it in a way that offers it in many different formats, and whether that's could still be a brochure, but it could also be a discussion with a game sense advisor or engagement with a very sort of interactive tool like Play My Way.
It's essentially the step care principle that you described earlier that flows through many areas. That's just one of them, the information dissemination, if you will.
Right.
But that flows through the document.
Did you want to add to that, Marlene?
I would just say that I think that the important piece about this is that instead of it being reactive, it's really proactive, right? It's more from a public health approach and a prevention model that we're allowing people to have the information they need to be able to empower them and to make an informed decision moving forward. And that decision could be to walk out of that casino. So it's not as if we're only offering it in the casino environment. It's a multifaceted approach, and I think that's what's really the essence and the strength of this document.
And it takes informed consent to a level, as you implement it, that I don't think comes to people's minds. When you think about informed consent, you're thinking about having a lot of brochures, or when you go to the doctor's office and they give you 8 pages of paper and you sign it and say, yeah, it's okay to cut my leg off. But but you know, you put something like Play My Way, which is a very interventionist means of communicating information. And you know, part of your interpretation of informed consent is that the operator must provide a a tool by which you can be informed of your losses as you go along and make, so, that's part of it, I think, too. It can be used as a cop-out. It can be used as, hey, we got brochures all over the place, just all they gotta do is read the brochures and we're fine. But you take it to a much more intense level, and it does imply, it doesn't more than imply, it compels participation on the part of the operators as well.
I would just add to that that the framework, I think, has a nice blend of regulatory pieces and then collaborative approaches, as Mark addressed earlier. And so it does just what you're saying. I think it allows for some strict guidelines, but also some creative approaches, and has been informed by a number of different parties and stakeholders. So that speaks to it's not just people writing things in brochures that they think have to go out per regulation. It's really a more blended approach and an engaged approach. So, I mean, I think that this framework continues to be so incredibly strong because it is lived out day to day by people whose whole job is to meet the players where they're at. And so those game sense advisors are so essential to making up the vast majority of this framework really come to life every day.
Yeah, that's good. Right.
The other question I was going to ask is, relates to some of your work, Commissioner Zuniga. You lay out a bunch of things that the operators must do. They have to have an executive committee, a responsible gaming executive committee, and have some programs and so forth. Do we audit? At the moment, we only have one facility, but do we audit the facility to be sure they're doing the things that are in our plan?
Yeah, well, do you want to answer that, or let me?
Yeah, I mean, let me take a quick stab at this. There are certain things, if it's a regulation, that we can, this is intended to provide the orientation and guidelines and many different tactics, not all of which are regulations. Where there's regulations, where there's a responsible gaming plan that our licensees present to us and we approve, we can audit that. I think if I were to think about where we're going with this responsible gaming framework, once it's adopted and thinking down the line, I think something more like not an audit, but a review and some feedback that would encourage cooperation, encourage innovation on behalf of our licensees, so that we can work together again to the end that we're creating a culture that fosters responsible gaming, positive play.
Yeah, let me just supplement that with we have in the works the idea that in this compliance group that I'm part of, to have a midterm review of the license of Plainridge Park, of which the responsible gaming plan, the one that they submitted to us and we approved, could be an essential component. There's others, and that's that's one of the things that, again, as Mark suggests, the word audit carries all kinds of connotations. We do a lot of audit, by the way, on many instances, and that's kept a lot of people busy quite a bit, namely on the monies and the internal controls and what have you. But the intention is to do a midterm review that will include the responsible gaming implementation.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. So go ahead now if anybody wanted to have other.
No, I just thought it might be helpful to just point out some of the changes in the two documents, the version 1 and the version 2.
Sure. So a couple things right off right from the start. I think that you'll see that we integrated our research and evaluation. Up front, we integrate data from the Sigma study, as well as Magic, on page 8. So I guess really pages 5 through 8. That's been really important. We have some preliminary data, preliminary evaluation that I think support some of the initiatives that we have underway. We want to highlight some of that data as well. We revised the key terms to be consistent with the other those that are used with the Mass Gaming Commission. So in version 1, we talked about a responsible gaming information center. It was before we even conceptualized we had the concept, but we didn't have the game sense to match that up. So we're starting to call out by name game sense and Play My Way. We went into the area of talking about responsible gaming as it relates to the digital gaming applications, and this is something that we stuck it pretty much right to the brick and mortar of the casino operations in version 1. We're recognizing that the nature of gaming continues to evolve, and responsible gaming needs to evolve with that. The American Gaming Association updated their code of conduct, and as it relates to marketing, we made sure that we updated our code as well, or our tactics as well, to reflect some of those changes. We went back in strategy 5. We worked closely with Todd Grossman to make sure that our strategy 5, as it relates to high-risk financial transactions, is reflective of the work of the commission. We added a new tactic in that strategy 5 that dealt with ATM exclusion. So this is something that the technology exists to allow individuals to exclude from ATM transactions at a casino. It's not very well used, and I think that there's all sorts of potential there. Just as somebody might voluntarily self-exclude, but below that, exclude from marketing, exclude from credit, perhaps they want to exclude from cash activity from an ATM machine as well. And I credit PPC actually for pointing that one and that possibility even out to us. So it's another example of innovation that comes through partnership as opposed to us doing our own homework, which we do, by the way. We absolutely do. We added a new we revised strategy 6 to delineate sort of engaging the community from within the casino, as well as engaging the community outside of the casino. These casinos, especially a casino like Plainridge Park Casino and even MGM, are part of the community. They are local regional casinos, and their involvement, as they very well know, and part of their success is largely dependent on engaging the community and being good stewards within the community. And finally, we added an entirely new strategy 7, that dealt with evaluation and assuring that we are paying attention, our licensees are paying attention to research that we're creating or evidence that we're creating, as well as more broadly evidence that is being created, and responding to that as we jointly in partnership advance these tactics and create new tactics. Did I miss anything, Marlene and Teresa, and Enrique, of things?
Yeah, let me mention a couple of things to that end. I think that's a great summary. Let me just mention, I have been part of the last few, in the initial discussions, and then the last few really working phone calls, and in some instances working meetings, in revision mode. If we simply had a document presented to us in full revision mode, I believe it would be too busy.
Yeah.
Given that there have been a lot of changes, some of which are necessary just by terminology, and that may not necessarily be that big of a policy change, which is why I think this format works to be presented here. We could all go back and look at them side to side and very quickly see the differences. I want to get into a couple of them in a few minutes, But let me also mention first that what I think I brought to this group, if I can say so myself, was the balance between what was clearly a tendency to try to add a lot more detail, because we obviously have a lot more detail. We have 5 more years. So where we first started doing a lot of basic principles, and that was great. And as you mentioned, we all like that. We now have 5 years of game sense and play my way and information and whatnot. And there was what I thought at times, key times only, not often, a tendency to try to write a regulation. And I was at least there at a couple of times to say, to remind people, let's make sure this is not a regulation. There's regulations behind it in some key areas here. Let's not try to be so specific that it misses the purpose of this being a framework. So having said that, I can get into a couple that I think I'd be good to point out to my fellow commissioners as to get their sense. My understanding is that we'll hopefully get some really good feedback from from the community, from many our licensees. I understand we're going to present this at the conference that the Mass Council hosts later this month, and that will just be an ongoing process. Is that sort of?
Yeah, that's
Great,
helpful.
yeah.
Also, Mark, that the survey results, those are very high numbers.
Yeah.
It's really good. It's a sense that program is really working well for people.
Yeah, I think the timing was right for a number of these different initiatives, both in terms of how well technology works and people's acceptance and value of some of the resources that we're offering.
So I wanted to get to, if that's okay, to one principle here. I try to keep it at a high level on page 20 on the voluntary self-exclusion. And this is something that we now have first-hand experience with this. And this is the sentence that reads on the second paragraph, that gaming wins and losses by banned individuals will be transferred to the MGC Gaming Revenue Fund. And one thing, and we've talked about this, and I think it's perhaps relevant to highlight here for future reconciling. My understanding is that my recollection is thinking about this when we drafted this was that it's important to communicate to the player and the casino that if somebody is found to be in violation of their voluntary self-exclusion, then that's it. The credits, the jackpots, whatever had happened up until that point is actually by statute had to be directed to the Gaming Revenue Fund. What this language has translated or has resulted in practically or in reality is that then the gaming agents and the casino have found themselves trying to have to go back to the history of that individual at the property to try to determine what may have been a win and a loss. Because for PPC and for the Gaming Revenue Fund, those categories are different. If there is some kind of loss or some kind of win, let's say, some kind of balance, all of it goes to the Gaming Revenue Fund as opposed to losses being split 51-49 because they get taxed at 49%. And that has proven to be some kind of burden when that happens. Doesn't happen all that often, but when that happens, they have to go back to the tape, they have to figure out where that person may have been, more than one machine, or et cetera, et cetera. And what I just remember thinking is the language about wins and losses is to communicate that that's it. There's none of these. You cannot claim that this balance was from a loss or from a win, so that we don't get into that necessity of having to try to figure it out. my understanding was that at that point, all of it, the balance, your Tito's, whatever it is, gaming revenue fund, without the necessity of having to go back to the tape. And that's one concept that it is right here, that there's also a regulation. If the intention is to try to put people in an investigatory mission, really, that, by the way, by necessity has to be bound by some time. It's very hard after a couple of hours of tape to at times figure out if there had been any more play. So that's one area that I wanted to highlight. It probably reads the same, but that's given the experience that we've had in between the last time we wrote this. It's one concept that I wanted to introduce as important to highlight.
So are you suggesting that we do this differently, that we enforce this reg and this policy differently?
Yeah, I'm suggesting, in my opinion, it should be, let's just see what the balance is. That's it.
At that point in time.
Yeah, point in time. And whatever the balance it is, it's going to go, all of it, to the gaming revenue fund. Right. And that because the play up until that point could have done any number of offsets, +1, +10, -10, +10, -10.
Right.
The amount of time that is spent on that, I think, is not the intention. It's resulted in, a bit of a burden on gaming agents and the casino when that happens.
So we did have this discussion, and I believe that that was the intention early on. I recall the discussion about when a person signs up for the voluntary self-exclusion program, it's a contract between the individual and the casino in the form of this enrollment into the program. And that when somebody violates their self-exclusion agreement with the casino, they forfeit anything that's on the machine, any jackpot winning that they would have, and that's right. I believe that that's the right path forward. The casino too should. The idea was the casino too should not benefit or not profit from money that was lost by an individual that was on the voluntary self-exclusion list on the gaming floor and gambling. The implementation of this idea, taking this concept in theory and implementation, I do understand has created some challenges and a lot of work for the gaming agents and casino. Is that, I guess, to me, is it worth this idea that nobody benefits from when somebody on the voluntary self-exclusion list walks onto the gaming floor? Is that worth it? Or what else could we do? Additional signage, what review of the efforts that our licensees go through to make sure that everybody's fully aware that beyond when you sign up for the list, that that it's not okay for persons who are on the list to come on the gaming floor while they're on the list.
Well, one of the things I have relative to in response to kind of like, well, where does the casino come into play here? Is that we look at their efforts, their internal controls, and we have the ability to impose penalties on them. For example, if we at any time begin to suspect that you don't seem to be doing enough, let's say, to as we believe is part of your duty. I think I come from fundamentally saying this is a voluntary self. Those two things reside on, the public proclamation that the individual makes, and he or she is tremendously disincentivized because he or she knows that any jackpots are going to be forfeited, automatically, and that's a guarantee that anything over $1,200 is going to be, stopped. Yeah. And confiscated. So anyway, I think I've made.
Well, I think this is a good issue, and it's a subsequent conversation that we could tee up. with the right folks. And I forget, Commissioner, I don't think the regulation's prescriptive. So it's an issue of how we enforce it.
Yeah, it's an issue of interpretation.
Yeah, so I would love to get Mr. Band here, Director Vanderlyn, and tee it up in a way that the commission could give us guidance on that. But I've heard obviously the parameters of what sounds like the
And
beginning of
maybe people from the licensees as well.
Absolutely, and our licensee, our future Category 1 licensees who might not have thought about this yet. Yeah.
If I could just say one last thing on that, I think the goal is that somebody who's on the list, our goal is that they're not on the gaming floor. What we don't want to go through the process of confiscating or escorting the person off of the gaming floor. That's not a good situation. So what can we do to prevent that from happening? To stop the person if they're contemplating it, to do what needs to be done that would stop them from crossing that line. And I think just generally speaking, as we contemplate this policy or regulation, I would love to look at it from that perspective of the prevention of people coming on the floor who are on the list.
Anybody else have comments on this idea? I don't have a, sorry, go ahead.
It's a good idea to get everybody
Yeah.
and listen to everybody.
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling about it, but I think it's worth one way or the other, but I do agree that it's worth teeing up. So if you will have that on your agenda, you and Ed, pull the right group of people together to talk about it. I had two quick things. I notice on page 23 that encourage breaks in play. We mandate or we implore that there be clocks displayed in prominent areas. Is that the case at Plainville? Are there clocks?
The one clock is in the Game Sense Information Center that I'm aware of.
Does that meet what you have in mind here?
No, it does not. But at the same time, the overall purpose of the framework is to lay out our orientation. I'm not under the illusion that every single piece of this is implemented, but in general, take a look at what the overarching strategy is for clocks, which is to promote public health and safety within the physical environment. And if we say, Plain Ridge Park Casino, what are you doing, or Wynn or MGM, what are you doing to do that? The idea is these are all ways in which you can accomplish that. Some of these are regulations and you have to. Some of them are great ideas.
Okay. Well, that goes again to the sort of what I originally called audit, but it's not the right word, but the sort of oversight assessment. There needs to be some sort of systematic way of making sure that these are strategies are being achieved.
Mm-hmm. Can I point one little thing there that I think is also important, and especially for PPC? And that's the last bullet there. It's provide lounge or sitting areas. I think it should read free of charge, by the way, but it reads well in general outside of the retail setting.
Yeah.
The notion there is that you could be just sitting. You didn't have to be forced to consume something or to play or occupy some seat that someone else might be, willing to use to play. And I think that's it just makes me remember the case that we had recently of the person who couldn't leave anybody at anywhere and resorted to leaving them in the car because there wasn't even a place to sit.
Yeah. Right. My last thing was on page 32. You talk about 8.8% enrolled. Isn't that the net number? That's more than that enrolled, but this is the number that nets, the percent that nets out.
Well, we'll take a look at that. I've seen over 10%. I've seen 8.8%. I don't know where it lands right now, but I'll just make sure that data is correct.
Okay, if maybe it's not enrolled, maybe it's remained enrolled or enrolled and sustained or something like that. Or, maybe it is accurate. I'm just not sure. But
I can add to that. That was taken directly from the evaluation. So that was individuals who remained enrolled throughout I believe it's an 8-month study period.
Right. Okay.
So that's what that figures.
Okay, but that's not quite what it says here.
Mm-hmm.
It says that's the total number of people that enrolled, which actually is a higher number than that.
Yeah, we can correct that.
So maybe just add the word remained.
Yep.
Right. It's great. Mike Sanglang, I didn't realize who was the artist behind this, but it's great. It looks really great. It's like we were complimenting Paul and Justin for a very, very readable document. And this is that too. It's great. It's really good. It's really interesting, really valuable. I'm looking forward to distributing it. So are we now putting this out for public comment? Is that the step we're at now?
So the bottom part of the memo, or the last piece, is the next step. So we will vet draft 2 with the commissioners, which we're doing now, and obviously you'll all give me your feedback. In addition to where we've discussed it today, the Public Health Trust Fund Executive Committee is another body in which we have a meeting in April. I would really like to see this on the agenda for that meeting. The Mass Partnership for Responsible Gaming is our licensees and a few other entities. I would like to have a sit down with them and really get their comments on that. The Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling's annual conference is March 20th and 21st. There's a session devoted to the revised responsible gaming framework. My vision for that is we do a presentation almost like this, and we get feedback from the people that attend that session, which are sometimes licensees, sometimes clinicians, sometimes people in recovery. And then we will put it out for public comment as well. We'll post for public comment. We will take it.
Is that now, you mean? Put it out now?
Yeah, starting out now.
Yeah, because Elaine, that would be something we might want to send out to all of our list for people to comment on.
My goal is to have a clean, final, approved framework by May 1st, which would become the useful document, especially as MGM is working quickly to open their doors.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. This is excellent, and the new format is terrific. The new ideas, you explained the improvements. They all sound terrific, and I didn't realize, and I didn't realize until I read your acknowledgments, that you've really done this amount of research. So there are 14 different agencies from 7 different countries that have helped inform your decision on how to what's important in the framework. So that's really impressive too. I had no idea you had done that level of research in order to accomplish this goal. So really well done.
Thank you.
I'll credit Marlene here because she has spent a lot of time, giving us feedback, coming to these meetings, and helping the team. In addition to Jeff, of course, and Mark and Teresa here, but to help guide this very good new version.
Looks great.
From afar, I'd like to make a couple of comments.
Please go ahead.
Okay, first of all, unfortunately, the reception while Commissioner Zuniga was speaking was largely muffled, and so I can't respond to that. But with regard to the framework itself, the draft of the framework, I think it's an extremely thoughtful, impressive document. What I like most about it is that it's reflective of being evidence-based. It succeeds very well as a framework, in fact. And most important in my mind is that it's a dynamic instrument in the sense that it appears to incorporate the lessons and experiences of actual operations, and also incorporates the research results to date into the new programs and into the new programs and the priorities. And in that sense, it does something unusual, and it actually closes the research loop, if you will, the evaluation loop, and applies the results of research to actual operations and the realization of the objectives of the framework. So, Mark and Teresa, it's really a wonderful job.
Thank you. Commissioner McDonald, if I can just respond quickly to one of your comments. I think, we state up front that we try to draw on evidence where evidence is available, and it's really exciting to start to use our research, to start to use evaluation, to realize that we're using that to inform our practices. We still hold on to the precautionary approach, which would basically say where there is an evidence, we won't sit back where there's a reasonable degree that we could expect harm to exist. But wouldn't it be great that we continue to chip away at this where we aren't relying upon that precautionary approach, and that we develop the evidence, a solid foundation of evidence that we build all of our programs, all of our services on.
Well, I think that that's probably the most fundamentally exciting thing about this, and that's why I use the word dynamic, because as you do your research, it's applied in practice to the refinement of the strategies that are being implemented. Couldn't be more important.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And it's been exciting for us. People have been working on the research to finally start to switch from a baseline project into actually the longitudinal reiteration of the research and beginning to generate data that can bear on this. And I agree, it's incredibly important, Commissioner, and a great part of this.
Can I also just emphasize the precautionary approach is really a very important principle, which is I'm just repeating a little bit of what Commissioner McDonald was alluding to. I'm remembering the conference that we were in a couple of weeks ago. One of the presenters essentially making the same argument. In the historical context, traditionally, everybody, not just the industry, has taken a very hands-off, there's no evidence, we can't really do anything until there's evidence that the intervention is not causing harm, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really important principle in this framework, and it has translated into things like Play My Way,
Absolutely.
frankly, and other approaches, game sense, of course, and whatnot. So I think it's very important to highlight the way we have.
And that's really been a breakthrough initiative. It's actually started with Mark. It was Mark's language at the first instance way back.
Yes.
And it is, you're right, the industry has almost hidden behind the need, the arguable, the assertion that you have to have not only research, but oftentimes peer-reviewed, so-called peer-reviewed research before you can do anything. And that's an incredibly constraining parameter. And there's been pushback from others to us on this, on Mark's utilization of this principle and the implementation of this principle. Although I will say that some of the people who have pushed back, MGM for one, AGA for another, probably Penn for another, have begun to adapt and take, and appreciate, I think, that we've adopted this principle. And Mark is clear to say that where we take a precautionary approach, where we introduce things, the utility of which has not been clearly demonstrated, that evaluation is a really critical variable, and we will continue to do that. And we do that more probably than anybody in the whole world, or certainly in the United States, in terms of evaluating these things, these initiatives, particularly where they're not based on comprehensive data-driven evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I just want to say something to that, because I as you all know, work in a number of different markets in other states, and the industry is still scratching their heads in other places as to how research is happening on the gaming floor, how research is happening in collaboration with the gaming industry. And so you have not only provided evidence and evaluation methods that have helped here, but I think really you could be credited for starting a change in the industry, because the worlds have always been very separated. And so this document, I think, goes far beyond where folks once considered the industry to be, in terms of looking at not just saying around the precautionary approach, but saying you can be a partner, you can be a stakeholder in this effort to draw conclusions about what is working, what's not working, and providing data in a field that just generally there just wasn't there. I mean, the reason there's a precautionary approach is because no one was doing this research, no one was funding this research. So I really think a number of folks talked about the Massachusetts model, but to me, this is the crux of it, is that this is really crucial for the industry in general, not just the player protection and the work happening here in Massachusetts.
Great.
And can I also offer credit to the Reno model? We simply were doing what the Reno model suggests. Have a framework if you're going to then go back and implement it, and then establish regulations after that. So
although Director Vanderlinden and I have just written a chapter for the book on the Reno model, where we are very clear about how far beyond the Reno model we've gone, and how there were substantial limitations in the Reno model. But you're right. We started out by following the parameters of the Reno model, one of which was set out a framework. I don't think the Reno model anticipated the kind of framework that we were going to set out.
well, it's a model, and that's how I read it. Then we add the details in a framework. There's further details in regulations, and so on and so forth. And then there's evaluation, and we repeat. Anyway,
have we given you our chapter?
Yeah.
We did. Okay. Yeah. All right. Anything else on this topic? Other comments? Yeah.
Really well done.
Great stuff. Yeah. So we'll have about a month or so of various kinds of feedback and iterations and so forth, and then try to button this up by the end of April, 1st of May.
Right.
Great.
Correct.
Super.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
And I think you have one more.
Right. And I'm pleased to just turn that over to Teresa and Marlene. So,
all right.
Take it away, Teresa.
Ms. Fiore.
Good afternoon, Chairman. As Mark said, today marks the first day of Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And it is a national awareness campaign established to bring awareness to issues associated with problem gambling and to highlight the resources available to individuals and families who may be affected. Like many of our other responsible gaming initiatives, we partner with the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling in supporting the outreach plan by the Game Sense advisors at Plainridge Park Casino. So we are in good company in Massachusetts with some of our neighbors who are also getting involved with this. I know the Connecticut Lottery actually just sent me over it's abbreviated PGAM, their PGAM plan. I know Rhode Island does a lot. I think Vermont and maybe even Maine does some things as well. But we take it a little bit differently. So most of all of the year except for this month, our Game Sense advisors really focus on guests and visitors to the casino itself. This month we really dedicate and focus our efforts on the Plainridge Park employees themselves. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, because they work within the gaming industry, especially on the floor, they themselves are at a higher risk of developing a gambling problem. And secondly, they are sort of additional eyes and ears, and they are, facing customers every single day. So if they see something, they can work with our Game Sense advisors to ensure that we are aware of it, and we are just keeping gambling as safe and as fun as it possibly can be for everyone. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marlene, who's going to provide a bit more background on the month itself and share her perspective from the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling.
Thank you, Teresa. So Teresa laid it out really well, and I think PGAM is, and I'm assuming most of you are aware, used to be a week and has transformed into a month because there are so many activities. This was actually a brainstorm from Tim Christensen, who used to work in Nebraska and Arizona, and Keith White famously started on a napkin at a Johnny Rockets. So here we are today, and it has evolved tremendously. And the good news is that Keith will say, people remind me that March is Problem Gambling Awareness Month because everyone's acutely aware of how they're going to spend their money. They're making sure they save their key things for March. So it's great. And as we know, lots of months get celebrated for lots of reasons, and to raise general awareness, I think we finally have a seat at the table, and I think that's tremendous. I'm going to provide you some background on kind of, the Mass Council kind of has a split personality in the sense that we do a lot of work as it relates to general awareness around problem gambling, and then we also do work around responsible gambling. And so some of the work around problem gambling is pretty exciting for this month. We are trying to put out, every week we're going to be doing a lot around social media and putting out a 25-second, I almost said minute, that would have killed me, 25-second video via Facebook and sharing that. And again, getting a lot of key stakeholders, industry, folks in recovery, other human health and human service agencies to share that and build that social media presence. So that's something that is up on our Facebook page today. We are also trying to do a lot of traditional media outreach. I've already been talking to reporters. Certainly, as you spoke with Justin and Paul about earlier, we certainly are getting a lot of calls as it relates to sports gambling and trying to generally raise the awareness of problem gambling and responsible gambling and what regulation that takes these things into account look like. So it's providing a lot of baseline information there. And then we do a lot of our kind of traditional pieces, trainings out at high schools. We know that high school age students are at high risk for gambling problems. They're a group that often get overlooked, and trying to do some basic work with both the high school students directly, but also with the professionals who work with them. Law enforcement, as a nice segue from what Christopher Bruce talked about earlier, not just around what they're doing, but also they're also in a high-risk category. We've been getting a number of calls from academies to come in and speak to the folks that are going through the academy and trying to build that as
The
a
police
bit of
academies?
and trying to build that as a new kind of a niche, because I think it's an area that no one currently is focusing on. So we're starting to do a number of those, having a number of those trainings and conversations. We always rely on going to our state recovery centers. As you all might be aware, that Massachusetts really leads in our recovery resources. And so we have a number of recovery centers, and these are centers that are, storefront. I think we're up to 9 or 10 of them currently in Massachusetts. And people who are in recovery with any number of things can walk in, and it's not treatment. It's really meant to be a place to connect with other people who are going through the same thing you're going through, but also get connected to job training, education, other resources to lead to building more protective factors in your life. So what they don't typically have are a lot of resources around gambling. So we're out trying to provide those resources and also build the awareness there so that those folks who are pretty high risk for a gambling disorder can have a better understanding how to prevent it, and if it happens, what are some of the ways that they can address it. We certainly participate in the National Screening Day, and that is something that Harvard Medical School's Division on Addictions at Cambridge Health Alliance initiated many years ago, and so that's on March 13th, where we're providing a short, their screen, the BVGS screen, to people at a number of different agencies. So we'll be working with a number of the treatment agencies in Massachusetts to screen all patients that are walking in, or have a table set up in a lobby. We're also working directly with the Mass State Lottery to have tables set up where we'll have screens and other information available at all their retail centers across the state. We are, and we don't have a full confirmation on this, but we are working to get a full confirmation on doing a State House Day, thanks to the hard work of Representative Wagner's team and working with his group there. Certainly promoting some of the work out of the Public Health Trust Fund, one of which is the updated Your First Step to Change guidebooks that the DOA and DPH have just recently updated, and making sure that people are aware of all the gambling resources that are available through the Mass State Clearinghouse, because there's now a kind of new grouping of materials there. And then one of the things that I think I've spoken to you about in the past is that every May we provide a Your First Step to Change recovery weekend. And this is for people who are struggling in early recovery, could be in long-term recovery, but are trying to sustain that. And that is in a place where kind of set them out in the middle of nowhere in Bolton, Mass, and give them an opportunity to connect with other people who've struggled with similar things, bring a number of speakers in, give them some time one-on-one with clinicians. So that's something that we will be promoting and recruiting for throughout March, although we already have a lot of our slots filled.
How many people typically come to that?
So we don't have money to do much more than we're hoping to get somewhere in the range of 25. I think we already have 18 people signed up for it.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very powerful weekend. And then, you know, I'll talk about the games and stuff in a moment, but certainly a number of folks have alluded to the fact that we're having our statewide conference on March 20th and 21st at the 4 Point Sheridan in Norwood, which is really focusing on the public health response. And, you know, that's what a lot of these items that Mark comes and speak to you about comes from, certainly the work from the Department of Public Health. And I'm pleased to say that there's the Gaming Commission will be well represented there in terms of talking about the framework, talking about the Public Health Trust Fund Executive Committee and some of the other projects that come out of that, including the research. Dr. Rachel Volberg will be present. We will have Justin, and we haven't invited him yet, but Paul hopefully will join him to talk about sports gambling and online gambling and the white paper, and hopefully bring some legislative perspective into that. So in addition to all of that, we also are going to have a number of key researchers in the field. Dr. Heather Chapman, who comes out of, who works with out of the VA system, the only person who focuses on gambling in the VA system. She will be here speaking. We will have someone who's out of the University of British Columbia, Dr. Eve, I'm going to butcher her last name, I think it's Litchfield Olson, who will be here talking about near misses and gambler's fallacy and what happens in the brain. We will have Dr. Sarah Yip and Dr. Patrick Warlunski out of Yale, who will also be doing a little bit around what the brain, comparing gambling disorder in the brain as it relates to, as it connects to cocaine disorder, or folks having troubles with cocaine. We have folks coming from EDC, the Educational Development Center, talking about some of the prevention work that's happening there. We have researchers coming out of BU who have some work with prevention and substance misuse and how that relates to gambling, and a whole bunch of other folks. The gentleman who coined the term positive play, Dr. Richard Wood, is going to be coming in and doing that, and also talking about his site that he set up called Gam Talk. So a really robust agenda. We invite all of you certainly to be there, but also to have the public and others join us, and they can sign up through our website. So that's kind of the crux of the general work of the Mass Council, but specific to the Game Sense Center, we have really built with certainly Teresa and Amanda work very closely together and do a great job. And they have their great pal Lisa, who has left, but Lisa McKinney from PPC, who have all worked really closely together to develop a really robust program for the back of the house. And what's interesting, and I think actually helpful, is that most casinos spend March looking at back of the house, and then spend Responsible Gambling Education Week looking at public and working on the gaming floor. We know gaming employees have double to triple the rate of gambling disorder that the general public has. And so really there's great reason to spend that amount of time, not just building their awareness of gambling, gambling programs and gambling resources if someone ends up with a problem, but really making sure that they better understand how it works. And I think I've said this over the years, but continue to be surprised at the folks who work on a gaming floor, and that's not just at PPC, but certainly I've seen in Connecticut and elsewhere, who work on a gaming floor but don't really understand how the games work. Our Game Sense employees do a great job of being able to break it down really simply for anyone who does anything at the casino, and be able to talk about that a little bit further. So they're going to be in the back of the house, in the cafeteria, what do you call it? Employee break room, to do presentations, to do a lot of the fun things that were a big hit last year, gambling quizzes, Family Feud. Amy has this great giant set of dice that she really likes, that she does this cool program with. They are doing Price is Right, the cost of play wheel that they have, Family Feud, word searches, know the odds, scavenger hunt. These are things that people really get engaged with. And one of the things we had is if they got engaged, they could enter into the raffle to get a basket. Well, as we know with gambling, the shorter the time period, the better for people to get the payoff, right? So we are now doing weekly raffle baskets for the employees, so that'll, I think, up the interest a bit. We're also providing free food because free food just works. So pizza and ice cream and other things that people will also be engaged to in seeing and come over to the table. There's also an opportunity for folks to nominate employees who've really kind of shown in this area, and I think that continues to build pride. And again, from my work all over the country, that's the number one thing you want to do is make sure people feel good about the information that they have and they feel good about the job that they can do. And being equipped with this information often makes people feel much better about the work that they're doing out on the floor. So we really want to continue to acknowledge that. And finally, the fun things, the interactions with the staff, the photo booths, and just continuing to build those relationships, because that continues to be a really important piece of the GameSense Information Center, is that our GSAs have good relationships with those staff. So the only thing I'll say before I turn it over to Teresa is that we're in the process of hiring for MGM and our GameSense advisors, and by virtue of that, we are doing a lot of that right now in March. And so right now we are building the awareness of GameSense. We are able to talk about Problem Gambling Awareness Month. So that's all happening simultaneously, and that's perfect. So the other last thing that GameSense is really trying to do is build social media, and Teresa's going to talk to you a bit about that.
Before you start, Teresa, did you say your conference is March 21st and 22nd or April?
20th and 21st, and it's March, like
March
3
20
weeks.
and 21st.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before,
And you're headlining, so I hope it's on your calendar.
Right.
So before I dive into our plan for social media, I just want to add to what Marlene say about the we're calling it a nominate a colleague submission, and that's something that we've actually done for the past year. Every 3 months, our GameSense advisors have nominated a few PPC staff members for contributing to the field of responsible gambling, which could be anything from, really dealing well with a patron who may have been distressed, or just incorporating RG into their role. And we acknowledge them in a quarterly newsletter that we send out with the help of Lisa McKenney to all of the PPC staff, and it's read to PPC staff members who don't have an email by their managers and supervisors. So they are acknowledged. In that letter, they receive a gift card from us, and most importantly, they receive a handwritten thank you note from Chairman Crosby. And that's presented to them in front of a lot of their peers, and it's actually what's really helped us gain momentum in this program. So
And they're really routinely framed and put on the wall, as
I gotta say, they love receiving those notes. And we have a little
Great.
GameSense stationery that he puts it on. So he asks for some information about what they've done to earn this nomination, and it goes in there. So it's really helping to build pride, I think, amongst the staff.
Great.
So as Marlene said, we're switching it up this month, and instead of the GameSense advisors nominating the staff members, we are having the staff members nominate each other. And it's just going to be done the same way. They're going to write what they see happening on the floor, and they are going to be awarded with a prize that's a bit larger than usual. And the person who actually nominates them is going to be given a small prize and thank you as well for
Great.
participating. So
It's terrific.
you have a lot of notes to write.
Yeah, great. My favorite part of my job.
Yeah. And so also just building on what Marlene mentioned earlier about social media, we were really trying to promote the GameSense MA Facebook, and I have the actual address written out in the memo for you, but we are going to be posting on it every single day. We're going to be holding contests on it and adding trivia questions to it. And so the idea is that Plainridge Park Casino staff who participate in it can go visit the GameSense table set up in the back of house during the month of March and show the GameSense advisor on staff that they have participated in it, and that participation will get them either a small prize or their name entered into one of the weekly raffle baskets. So we're really hoping to promote our social media that way. And finally, I just want to say that we have a few good years of experience with Problem Gambling Awareness Month, where we kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work, what people get really excited about. This is the first year that we really build sort of measurement and metrics into each of the programs. So we're going to use this year as a sort of benchmark in a library of different activities for the future. So hopefully this time next month, I'll have some positive numbers, which I'll be happy to share with you. Thank you.
Anybody questions, comments?
Lots of interesting things going on.
Year from now, it'll be a whole different program.
Commissioner McDonald, do you have thoughts or
No,
comments?
other than to say it's just very impressive.
Yeah. How are you feeling about the hiring for GameSense and MGM? How many people are there that you'll be hiring, and how's that looking?
So Amy Gabriela, who is currently our senior GSA at PPC, will move over and be our senior GSA at MGM, and so she's spending a lot more time in Western Mass. So currently, what we're trying to do is fill her spot first at PPC, and then move over. I think we're going to be just fine. What's fascinating and shouldn't shock us, but continues to shock us, is how many people Amy and Terrence know. So there are a lot of folks that might be coming up from those casinos in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so a lot of interest. So Amanda is spending probably 2 to 3 days a week interviewing, screening, talking with folks. The great news is we've had some tremendous candidates already move forward that are bilingual, trilingual, and we're really psyched about that. So yeah, I think we're gonna have a great team in place by this fall.
How many will it be?
You want to answer that? Given the budget hasn't been approved yet.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, it's based on the budget, but we're trying to replicate what's happening at PPC, which is staffing it 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Good.
So we recognize that it's a huge casino, much larger than PPC. So we're trying to build staffing that would accommodate, that large space. So it's probably looking at having a couple of GSAs on most of the time.
All the time. Great, terrific, great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Good work.
All set, Director? All right, so that is the end of our agenda items, other than commissioner updates. Anybody have any?
One quick update. Jill Griffin and Paul and I are going to be back out in Springfield on Monday. We have a number of events with MGM's procurement team, which is still in the area looking for suppliers and vendors. So there's an event with the local commercial lending community. There's a meeting of our vendor advisory task force, and then in the evening there's an event with a new minority business alliance that's formed to help minority businesses put themselves in a position to be.
When is that?
Monday.
Oh, great. Good. Commissioner McDonald, anything on your end?
No.
All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor? Commissioner Cameron?
Aye.
Commissioner McDonald?
Aye.
Commissioner Stebbins?
Aye.
Commissioner Zuniga?
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much.